Um, I'll just very briefly just make Marta co-host so when the time comes she can show any slides and then we'll get started. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody to the third day. Great to see people again. Our first speaker is my friend and colleague Eli Kramer, who is at Wrocław in Poland presently. He's recently the editor of a book on philosophy of culture as theory, method, and way of life. And he's done a good deal of work over the years on philosophical community. And today he's going to be talking to us on a title which has in fact changed overnight. But Eli, perhaps given that it has changed, I'll hand it over to you and we can commence. Cheers.
Thank you, Matt, and for organizing this event, and to all the other wonderful speakers who have started us out. I'm going to try to get through as much as I can of a longer paper, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I will start a time clock for myself too to make Matt's life a little less stressful by keeping me on it. So, whoops, excuse me, the wrong mode. Desktop. There we go. Okay. So, thanks again for everyone being here. Just move to the side. The new title for my presentation is "The Fools and Their Stars: The Role of Systematic and Speculative Works in a Philosophical Way of Life." So, introduction. In this presentation, I consider whether engaging in systematic and speculative philosophy has the potential, excuse me, let me turn on the timer, the potential to enrich a robust philosophical way of living in relation to wisdom, or rather reinforces an overly rarefied, scholastic, and tragically foolish way of life. If the latter case is true, does it isolate us from enacting and illuminating for others relevant, rich, and meaningful ways of living, given our cosmic condition? Here, I hope to continue to extend the work of my colleagues, Professor Simone D'Agostino in the audience, and Dr. Laura Mueller, who also see in certain kinds of grand speculative philosophical works in the moderns and other historical epochs something of essential value for philosophy as a way of life. I suspect that Alfred North Whitehead was right that we have missed much insight from such grand treatises, which have gotten lost since the turn to cognition-obsessed technical epistemological works. And what has been lost had insight that should be recovered in order to live well, and to live better. Well, given the time constraints today and my own preliminary research in this direction, I will not be able to get very far. I hope to set out the problem properly and set us in a direction I think may prove fruitful. So, again, to set our compass aright, let us start with the following question. And here it is in front of you. Are great philosophical works that guide us through dynamic thought, the reflection and identity with the nature of the whole of our cosmic condition, reinforcing a scholastic intellectualism that limits our ability to live in and of the world and be of service to it? I will argue that while there is indeed much risk of narrowing instead of broadening our philosophical clarity of vision for writing or closely studying these kinds of works, there is also great promise in them. If great speculative works of philosophy, i.e. ones that really indicate something about our cosmic condition, are treated as spiritual exercises, to be ever renewed, instead of merely the exhaustive reduction of reality to a set of linguistic signs that the human animal can articulate in discourse, they are a vital training in amor fati, loving, consenting to, finding peace in our cosmic condition and felt identity therein, while expanding our horizons to what is possible for ourselves and others beyond the confines of our habitual ways of thinking and acting. They reconsole us to our cosmic lot and offer new relevant insight for the problems of life and the world that can empower us to prudent action. Section 1. Divine Spinoza, forgive me, I have become a fool. So Dr. Nahum Pichelsson, a man both committed to the serious and meticulous scholarly study of Spinoza's ethics and to practicing it as a philosophical way of life, laments and celebrates at the end of the wonderful short story, The Spinoza of Market Street, by Poland's celebrated philosophical and mystic writer, Isaac Bashevis Singer. Without divulging too many more details from a wonderful work that my former graduate school professor, Kenneth Stickers, rightly said every philosophy graduate student should read, let me just say that this novel circles around a central thematic in philosophy as way of life, which I will use the shorthand of PWL for, that we in this field have not so thoroughly explored. That is, whether it is the Phalaisian philosophers lost in their own studies, atopos and seemingly uprooted from the places and values of their time, daydreaming, absent-minded, and sometimes comically unequipped for daily life, whether living communally or individually, who are fools, or rather whether those in the rest of society are the true fools. As the celebrated Polish PWL scholar Juliusz Domonski has noted, this theme runs deeply in the current of ancient philosophy. It is already well developed in Plato, who in the Theaetetus uses the classic comic tale of Thales falling into a ditch because he was too busy contemplating the cosmos, as in, quote, occasion to make a eulogy for the virtues of philosophers, virtues who do not have solely intellectual character, but which, taking their origins in the knowledge of true being, find their fulfillment in a special way of life. This manner of living, marked by traits which always remain ridiculous or even bizarre in the eyes of the crowd, demands a special denomination. We find it in the adjective atopos and the substantive atopia, which fulfill in the philosophical language of Plato a function which seems to be reserved for expressing in the most adequate and synthetic manner the personality of Socrates. Indeed, end quote. Indeed, in Plato, the portrayal of the tragic-comically authentic personality of Socrates, set against the all too foolish and vain ambitions of many of his dialectics, and especially of those in power in Athens, is designed to lure readers to follow in the footsteps of Socrates' transvaluation of the values for living a good life. His work engaging people to deeper, authentic inquiry in the agora demonstrates the transformative potential of philosophy. There is yet a deeper tension, though, as it is the Socrates of the speculative, technical, and epistemologically focused Theaetetus, which is an ode to the unfoolish character of the Thalassian philosopher, and not the personality of the more socially and politically active Socrates found in the early and middle dialogues, or in the late laws. It is only towards the end of the dialogue that there's a hint of commitment to the care for the city, both with the discussion of truth and persuasion in law, and when we are reminded that Socrates is heading to his trial, which we know will lead to his death due to his commitments to justice. If we take one step farther back and recollect when we ourselves were first seriously reading this difficult text, or other difficult speculative and technical later dialogues, we may get further insight into this tension. After finally gaining some vital insight, after parsing it and trying to specify the difficult systematic whole we intuit in that dialogue, most likely by ourselves in an office or a coffee shop, dorm room or library, paying no attention to the world around us, as our afternoon slipped into night, we might sympathize far more with Thales than with the activist Socrates. Even when we finally achieve those rare moments of true revelatory insight and metanoic transformation, there is a concern that our conversion is perhaps that of the fool, instead of opening up a live relation to wisdom, especially a relation to wisdom that might make some difference that makes a difference for greater society. Most of us have not tested our mettle in public as Socrates did after all. It is always precarious, whether carefully studying the origins of the knowledge of true being in writing and reading will really find their fulfillment in a special and not mere absurd way of life. Rather, no matter how deep the insight, even if it verges into the mystical, I find that the metanoia available to us as scholars engaging with the spiritual exercise of writing or reading systematically rigorous speculative philosophical works all too often leads to the sort of experience Pierre Hadot had after spending a month or so completing his, if I may use the term here in a PWL sense of being somatic and existentially rich, spiritually inspired work, Plotinus or the Simplicity of Vision. Quote, I have already elsewhere described how, after having stayed cloistered for a month in order to write this small work, I had, while going out to get bread from the baker, a strange impression. But I misexpressed myself in my story when I wrote, I had the impression of finding myself on an unknown planet. In fact, in seeing the ordinary folks all around me in the bakery, I rather had the impression of having lived a month in another world, completely strange to our world, and worse than this, totally unreal and even unlivable. I have emphasized the last line myself, end quote. Although I have never had such a deep mastery of any philosophical works as Hadot had of Plotinus, I certainly have come out of all too many days of deep attempts at reading the great works of philosophy, or attempting my own speculations, wondering whether the world I had explored or created that putatively was about our place in the cosmos were in fact real, or were of any concrete meaning to a rich life, and if their values were even livable. Such sensitivities are perhaps what drew me to the figures like John Dewey, William James, and Richard Rorty at the beginning of my career, who all too acutely felt those concerns. As Hadot suggests, the prognosis here could be quite grim, for it might mean that our deep studies of the great speculative works of philosophy that aim to illuminate our relation to broader vistas of reality may be unreal, that is, lost in Kantian castles in the air, or as Whitehead would later put it, are vacuous actualities. Real in the sense that the accounts do exist and say something that has real effects in the world, but empty of needed relevant content for deepening the quality of lived experience. We are not alone in having this concern. It is founded throughout the history of philosophy and higher learning. For example, in the Western Enlightenment, building on a tradition rooted in Aristotle, there was even a concern that such speculative technical scholarly study might be a sickness, a pathology, or in their language, a malady of consciousness. There's a wonderful work for those curious by Ansi Vila called Suffering Scholars that carries out a genealogy on the emergence of extremely popular texts at the time on the subject, such as Samuel Auguste Tissot's famous Maladies of the Men of Letters, which was revised and updated across the 18th century and into the 19th century and had numerous editions. This worry is only enhanced by what we know in PWL scholarship about how, through a series of complex developing currents and countercurrents, Western PWL spiritual exercises were largely relegated to Catholic monasteries, and the rest of philosophy became reduced or embedded as a liberal art handmaiden to the higher faculties into a life of faith in medieval universities. With the rise of the German Research University and the profession of philosophy, it became ever more scholastic and technical in its organization, and ever more divorced from guiding and supporting deeper and more authentic value-driven living. It is no wonder then that those committed to the study and practice of PWL have long suspected, or at least had concerns about, the penchant for systematic metaphysical, cosmological, and ontological studies in philosophy, inevitably inclining one towards formal scholasticism of a rarefied sort that leads to a life of hermitage with a philosophy unreal for and sensitive to the needs of human life and experience. To understand this concern, as well as see the promise of broader philosophical speculation, however, let us first clarify the idea of speculative philosophy itself, beyond the narrow anachronism drawn from Hegel. Rather, I will try to articulate what this kind of systematic philosophical literature does for writer and reader as a spiritual exercise that is of essential value to philosophical ways of living, despite its inevitable dangers. So, next section. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Today, this classic quote from a haunted Hamlet has become the banner-bearing aphorism in the humanities for the narrowness of the scholastic pretensions of academic philosophy in its quest to unveil reality. We professional philosophers, while defending ourselves to the public, often begrudgingly acknowledge its painful truth to each other. Is there any hope then that our speculations might escape narrow solipsism? Are we hubristic fools because we inevitably, if subtly, take our all too prosaic fantasies for heaven and earth? While I cannot here go into the complex history of the differing and contested approaches to what I'm calling speculative philosophy, which could provide more nuanced answers, we can begin by clarifying at least some aspects of my particular use of the term to avoid gross and uncreative anachronism. I am not here seeking to build on Hegel's view of philosophy as inherently speculative in nature, nor am I calling for a return to neo-Hegelian idealistic projects. Rather, while this heuristic is helpful, we want to go to its roots in the history of Western philosophy. I will attempt all too hastily to outline a kind of philosophical work devoted to, as Professor Donald Philip Vereen in his excellent book on the subject of speculative philosophy puts it, quote, a way to embody the love of wisdom that distinguishes philosophy, to attempt to mediate and narrate the whole of things in a way that satisfies reason in its connection with sense, imagination, and memory, end quote. It is the kind of, quote, ultimate philosophical literature, a literature focused on what is absolute in human experience, end quote. And then another quote, like poetry, it aims to take language to its limits, but unlike poetry, philosophy attempts in this process to join imagination to reason. But before we further develop upon Vereen's vision of speculative philosophy, it'll be helpful to distinguish analytically exhaustive systematic philosophical curriculums and works from this kind of philosophical work that to me seems to at least go as far back as Plato's Timaeus. As I've explored elsewhere, drawing on the work of Ilsetraut Hadot, one can see how in the Western world, the emergence of what we might want to call a growing penchant for ever more systematically organized philosophical discourses and curriculums was fostered by the Alexandrian and Athenian Neoplatonic communities as they developed through late antiquity. To unjustifiably summarize a long and complex story over generations, they carried out a sort of creative misuse of the Platonic works, what I and Gary Herstein have called in an essay, hopefully to be published in the coming few years, creative systematizing, by trying to sort out a timeless system from Plato's myriad dialogues. Even more radically, Aristotle's works become a sort of critical liberal arts training for the deeper truths available in the Platonic dialogues. What is striking is that systematizing here is neither merely a new mode of diaresis, nor asceticis, nor a matter of organizing the domains of philosophy and the sciences, nor a straightforward metaphysics or ontology, but a curriculum that trains one to see the systematic whole cosmos through a sequence and organized reading of authoritative great works. The assumption of systematizing in this historical sense, first and primarily, was curricular to enforce a deep internalizing understanding of the origins of knowledge and true being. To again borrow that line from Demansky, with the tenets of the dogmatic school, so as to reaffirm and reinforce their fulfillment in a special way of life. Although I do not have time to defend this position here, let me just briefly mention my hypothesis that this curricular organization, as philosophical scholasticism gained dominance in the West as a study of nature, reinforced a certain perspective that systematic theoretical philosophy's one and only goal was an exhaustive analysis of all whole and parts in the great order of being, to create one final and still picture of reality that could reinforce Christian dogma. By the early to middle 20th century, with fully developed research universities and the organization of philosophy into a profession with a domain of knowledge to progress within, that quest for a complete image of the really real had by and large, save in small enclaves, given up serving the Christian faith, and was rather seen as the telos of philosophy itself. The logical positivist movement is but the end of this 2-millennium trajectory, where the systematic study of philosophy led to one final conclusion: to be demystified through the very rigor of the exhaustive logical, linguistic, and conceptual analysis that created its edifice. For our purposes, one more distinction is necessary to separate speculative philosophy from this penchant within our tradition for foreclosed systematizing that seeks to exhaust all explanation, all clauses, into finalized, neat, and clean parts, where their whole is reducible to its parts. While again, time limits me from going into full detail here, there is another form of thought, live thinking, dynamic, meandering, twisted, and flowing, that can, through disciplined dialectical striving, achieve non-exhaustive reflection. We are not far off from Kant's distinction between reflective and determinative judgments. A non-exhaustive reflective judgment also organizes the world. It generalizes from a particular context and formalizes the whole for its ends in a symbol. At our best, we recognize that our symbols never fully capture the world with conceptual definity, unless we make the mistake of flattening the symbol for the object of cognition, and as Kant would say, going beyond the limits of reason. We philosophical scholars, when working through the great challenging works of our traditions, struggle through live thinking to reach a reflective judgment of a sort. We have a feeling for the whole complex vision the work has given us, and we generalize to fill out its details. But the whole never reaches conceptual clarity. Instead, our aesthetic feel for the idea becomes ever clearer in thought and as can be used for action. Reading these great philosophical works is an asymptotic quest, one we do, of course, improve upon, especially in the history of philosophy, where philosophical scholars are sensitive to the subtleties of language and translation and the tensions therein. One never assumes one has exhausted, for example, the Mula Madhyarakarika, the Timaeus, or the Critiques, while with each read and further research, a keener sense of that whole is achieved. It is this experience of the struggle of live thought that disciplined to seek comprehension through reflective judgment, to emerge from the clouds and get a proper vista of reality, and then through getting a lay of the land to know our situation better, so as to know where to head, that defines speculative philosophy as a particular genre of philosophical literature, both in the writing and the reading. In the writing, it is the direct task of achieving this vista and then creating an order of exhibition for readers to be guided to struggle and reach this vista themselves. As Vereen puts it, speculation captures in thought, this is a quote, the inner life of the object. To speculate is to follow in language the inner movement of consciousness. To narrate the inner life of the object, speculative thinking is mimetic thinking, end quote. This kind of philosophical work is what I have called elsewhere a phylodynamic image. These works are written in such a way so as to guide us through aesthetic, imaginative, and intellectual experience of dynamic thought, e.g. dialectic, as it seeks to reach a non-exhaustive reflective judgment, in this case of our cosmic condition, in the sense of an ordered view of the whole of which we participate, and to experience identity with it, in Hadotian terms, cosmic consciousness, and then to return us to present life perception with new resolve and insight. Only through being exhorted to struggle to move through this practice in thought and feeling do we truly internalize and appreciate the full dimensions of this new view of reality and its relevancy to experience. This is the purpose of speculative, what I mistakenly used to call systematic philosophy, which aims at the greatest levels of generality, quote, to existentially guide and nourish growth in us through a series of transformations that reconceptualize the world around us, from the sensible to the foreign, and they do so from a variety of angles. Or to use Vereen's more elegant articulation, speculative philosophies, quote, are in the end written for philosophers. The purpose of speculative philosophy is the Socratic pursuit, the Delphic nulticitin of self-knowledge. The self can turn back upon itself only speculatively. Speculative philosophy, whether presented in objective or subjective style, is autobiography, an art of self-writing in which the philosopher comes to see what being is, and in terms of it, what the human being is, including the individual life is governed by the love of wisdom, end quote. And it is here that we begin to see the gift and risk that great speculative philosophical works afford us. For they guide us through and train us to have experiences of disciplined live thinking as it expands to broader horizons, the vistas of reflective judgment of cosmos, and the experience of being in touch or identity with it. From such a perspective, our narrowness of thought is dethroned of its authority. At their best, such works teach us that speculative philosophy is a live process, and there's always a larger, different whole views of reality to circumscribe our own egotistical horizons that get muddled down by the affairs of daily life to more egotistical concerns. They allow us further to see more of the cosmos in ourselves. For that reason, we always seek after, as Ralph Waldo Emerson put it in his essay on the subject, that, quote, unattainable, the flying perfect, end quote, ever beyond all we seek to circumscribe with our vision. The gift of arduously writing and endlessly reading such works is that they help us break our bad habit of exhausting thought in our narrow and often self-interested determinative judgments, through getting too committed to our analyses that reaffirm often all too narrow and dogmatic ways of living. Quote, critical reflection and analysis keep very tightly to those aspects of experience that can be understood, that can be ordered and classified. To speak about the whole, the philosopher must stand common sense on its head and attempt what is in principle impossible, to glimpse the whole of experience from within experience, to have the divine perspective. In other words, end quote. In other words, one must become seemingly foolish, even seemingly arrogant, to avoid being a deeper sort of fool and following into a deeper sort of hubris. And yet this is a never-ending practice, tragic in its unattainability and risk of dogmatic blindness, comic for most in the absurd way of life it requires, though essential to enriching human life practice. Speculation is always melancholic, quote, speculation is always melancholic because its task in principle cannot succeed. In principle, though it can never attain a vantage point outside experience and grasp it as a single object that can then be captured in speech. Yet not to undertake the task of speculative thinking is not truly to engage the power distinctive to the human being, reason. To restrict reason to critical reflection and analysis is to restrict the human, end quote. I'm wrapping up here. Good, and I'm well on time. I think I'll finish section 2 and then add some concluding thoughts. So it would take another much longer work to explore which sorts of great philosophical speculative works in the history of philosophy are and can be treated as speculative in this way. It would also include criteria for assessing which give us relevant account of experience and which are indeed merely edifying slopsistic play. I myself am inclined to Whitehead's creatively insightful, when properly understood, criteria of coherency, logicality, applicability, and adequacy. Though his idea about what those 4 terms mean, as usual with Whitehead, are quite different and distinct from pretty much most of the traditional philosophy. To me, in the Western canon, Plato's Timaeus, albeit through mythological imagery, Perphy's organization of the Aeneid, Emerson's Nature, Spinoza's Ethics, Henri Bergson's Matter and Memory and Creative Evolution, and of course Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, are quintessential examples of this movement of thought to a new reflective vista on an identity with cosmos. I end, however, this section with Cassir's assessment of how to properly engage with Kant's critiques, which despite their penchant for analysis, I think he demonstrates ultimately are a part of this oeuvre. So here's this grossly long quote, but I wanted you to just see it in full to follow along. Quote, if one approaches the definitions of analytic and synthetic judgments, concepts of experience and of the a priori, the concept of the transcendental and of the transcendental philosophy, as they appear in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, with the idea that one is hitting upon ready-minted coins whose value is settled once and for all, then one must inevitably be perplexed by the further progress of the book. It repeatedly becomes obvious that an inquiry which was apparently concluded is taken up again, that an earlier explanation is supplemented, broadened, even entirely transformed, that problems which had just been treated separately abruptly enter into a totally new relationship in which their original meaning is altered. At bottom, however, the only natural and necessary situation is precisely this mutability, since it is a testimony to the fact that we stand here in the midst of a living process and a steady advance of thinking itself. Much that in isolation appears contradictory is illuminated only when it is reintegrated with this flow and interpreted in its whole context. As more and more threads are spun together in this process, at last the ingenious web of concepts stands before us. A retrospective analysis is the converse, disentangling only the major aspects from the numerous complexes of concepts and laying down the broadest principles that guide the idea in all its ramifications and developments. My emphasis: the totality of the particular questions comprised by the system of critical philosophy is never exhausted by this procedure. It must suffice if the general articulation seen by Kant himself as the essential movement and the decisive criterion for judging the unity and solidity of his doctrine becomes visible and lucid. End quote. Cassirer thus adds one critical detail, that in order to properly appreciate the great speculative work, one cannot treat it as a series of propositions to be exhausted of meaning, but as a spiritual exercise that deepens upon each reading. In fact, if one does not, one will not properly understand it. So for the sake of time, I have a third section, which I am going to skip, but I will go just to my last line about how I feel about fools and philosophers. Whoops. Let me go to full screen again. Okay. While we Phalasian philosophers may foolishly fall into a ditch on occasion, or lose our hats, keys, and coffee mugs while we contemplate the stars, so long as we get our feet back on the ground of life and utilize what we learn to broaden the vistas for all, we can be sure of deepening arts of living. If we are lucky, perhaps we will even cause good Socratic trouble. We may be fools, but at our best, we can be fools of service to ourselves and others. And for that reason, I at least will keep looking at the stars, despite my stumbling gait. Not starts, too. Speaking of a stumbling gait. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eli. Okay, so I believe we have 8 minutes, more or less, and I'm seeing some hands as well, some claps, I believe, from Stephen, and then Michael, and then Massimo. So in that order, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Matt. Eli, thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. I guess I have a word maybe in favor of what you're calling analytic philosophy. I'm just wondering whether you find this sympathetic or not. So it seems like there was philosophy, which is analysis, and then non-exhaustive reflection, and then speculation. And the analytic kind seemed not connected to human concern, and kind of maybe wayward in other ways. But let me just suggest two ways in which it might be connected to human concerns. For one thing, even the most standard analytic philosophy, whoever we think of that as, it seems to wake us up in a certain way. Like we thought we knew what knowledge was, and you have just simple counterexamples, and then maybe we're not so sure what knowledge is. Or we thought we knew what justice was, and then maybe we're not so sure. So the Socratic gadfly idea of like getting people out of their slumbers might even be in the most hardcore analytic philosophy have a similar task. The second thought is that even very abstract analytic philosophy, I mean, it might not have guidance on how to live, but it might just be just this eminently worthwhile thing to do in its own right, just abstract thinking of a very high level, like abstract mathematics. So it might not give us guidance on how to live, but might be a great expression of the human mind. So I guess those are my two thoughts. Does that seem congenial or not congenial?
Congenial, but I think this is a good opportunity to bring a clarification. Exhaustive, systematic analysis, I do not define as analytic philosophy. In fact, I find the analytical continental pragmatic not a very helpful concept for what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a kind of high scholastic technical work that's more interested in classing concepts than bringing you through a certain experience of reason to a view of the whole cosmos. That could be a kind of spiritual exercise itself. So in other words, I'm talking about very particular kinds of philosophical work. Why does this matter for just your example? I want to point out, as Hadot suggests, there's a reason to think the Tractatus and the logical investigations, at least, are what I would call a philodynamic image, if not works of speculative philosophy yourself, depending about how you think about the kind of fallout at the end of Tractatus to the philosophical investigations. I would also probably, I didn't mention, include process and reality, but that falls into kind of both of the sort of, if anyone approached those series of brutal lectures, those both wake us up, and I certainly think have a penchant for a sort of a kind of exhaustive analysis, but that's not the be all and end all of the work. So,
Okay,
yes,
I see there are other people in line. So I guess I would just say that we could talk more, but I would maybe even want to make a defense about even that heavily scholastic philosophy, that maybe it has some use. But I see other people in line, so I'll bow out.
Thank you.
Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Eli, for a terrific paper. I just wanted to come back really quickly to your quote from Hadot there, when he talks the famous anecdote about when he goes down to the bakery after writing his treatise on Plotinus. I think his point there was not so much that Plotinus, his concentration on Plotinus made him uneasy because it's a theoretical work, but rather, quite specifically, because of Plotinus's attitude of, what shall I say, condemning or dismissing the sensible world. I'm not sure that Hadot had any particular aversion to speculative works as such, although it is true that in practice, he did tend later in his career to move away from such abstruse metaphysical constructions like those of Porphyry and Plotinus to philosophies of life like the Epicureans and the Stoics. So that, I think, is that was one point. The second one was, I think when we're talking about Hadot, it always seems to me we should remember that he was basically a philologist, right? I don't think not sure that his remarks would hold to reading works in translation, because he basically, if we recall, he basically outlines a two-step theory. The first is strictly objective. We use all the tools of philology and the historical studies, sciences, to figure out exactly what the author meant. And that's a spiritual exercise in the sense that we have to put aside our own prejudices. And we really have to strip ourselves of our prejudices in order to try to put ourselves in this headspace of the author. And if you try to figure out what he meant, what he or she meant by their text. So that's strictly objective for Hadot. And then in a very, very different, independent second phase, we go back on our result of this philological work, and we ask ourselves the question, what does this mean to me? And what I think is what's key is that Hadot emphasizes, and I think he's right, that we have to keep those two moments very separate.
So I'm going to try to answer quick since we have other questions and we can follow up in discussion. But your first point is good, and actually think it's something I need to spell out in the work in a longer version of the paper, which is my contention is, I think it's a continuum. There's no hard, fast lines here, but this exhaustive analysis approach tends one to a sort of anti-life orientation, a kind of vision of cosmos that actually divorces you from the world. So I'm probably have to qualify Hadot's purpose here, but I think there is an insight that's generalizable to what I want to talk about. And my intuition is that, interestingly, shares something that is a kind of in potential of the Neoplatonic tradition, especially later. Though there's other things going on too, of course. So anyways, that's my intuition I still have to work out. And then to the second point, I suppose I'm adding my own thoughts here of a different kind of spiritual exercise. I would say this is a particular kind of reading and engagement with the work that's not exactly, that comes from scholarly practice of reading a text, but it's actually something that the authors of speculative works try to guide readers through in the way they organize it. So you have a kind of a feeling of struggling and then coming to these moments of insight, coming to the end of the critiques, to the teleology, you have this kind of these moments, and there's other words in the phenomenology of spirit when you get to absolute. I'm trying to capture what it's like, why the writer is exhorting us to this experience. we'd have to talk about that on more, but I think it's actually, although scholars are probably the ones most likely to engage with these works in that experience, I actually think it's different than, say, trying to write the paper about the Timaeus and using it as a speculative spiritual exercise.
Thanks.
Perhaps I know Lauren also might have had a question, and Massimo, do you both want to perhaps ask them in one go, and then Eli can respond, and we can see if we can cut some time corners. Massimo,
Sorry, what's the suggestion?
just to ask a question, and I think Laura also had a question. I just want to see if we can get both in. Yep.
Okay, yes.
You need to move on shortly.
Sure. So I wonder if, to some extent, the problem here, in part, isn't that philosophy, just like any other broad umbrella activity, like science or art or whatever, has legitimate different uses that sometimes interact and sometimes they just don't. I mean, not all philosophy is supposed to be, and certainly is, useful in terms of, living your life, just like not all art is politically relevant, or not all science has actual consequences in real life and improves our lives and so on and so forth. But in other disciplines, this is not a problem. For us, somehow it seems to be a problem. And to one extent, I wonder why is this sort of a thing that is specific about philosophy? Why is it that we tend to think so much about this problem, which is not a problem for anybody else?
And Laura?
Yeah, so I just have two really quick comments and a practical pedagogical question for you. So comment one is, you mentioned earlier in Kant how we shouldn't mistake the symbol for the concept. So just the vocab word for that is subreption, in case you wanted to use that.
Thank you,
just
a
little more efficient.
Friend here.
Yeah. And my second comment, when you're speaking about Kant as speculative in this very specific way you're using the term, Kant actually, in the very first paragraph of his preface to the first edition, in the first critique, he says, "Human reason has a peculiar fate in one kind of its cognitions. It is troubled by questions it cannot dismiss because they are posed to it by the nature of reason itself, but that it also cannot answer because they surpass human reason's every ability." So I think for the article that you and I are going to write about this together, that would be a really good place to start with, is Kant starts by talking about reason by nature as speculative. So you don't have to rely solely on Kassir for that note.
Or
and then
Hegel, that helps.
right. And my question for you is, do you think there's a way to teach people to experience these texts in this way?
Good. Okay. Let's see if I can do this efficiently to help Matt with his job. Massimo, depends what you mean by use. As you know, again, I'll be in my white Hedian mode here. I don't mean by use, you have to use it for, social justice in the agora, or use here, for example, in the sciences, in a kind of white Hedian way of thinking, is all the advances we made in non-Euclidean geometry that we didn't understand for, what was it, half a century before we figured out what conic sections could do that were productive. So I recognize that without a longer paper, I can't really, I'm loading a lot onto that word. What do I mean by that? I can shortly summarize here. Use in this concept for speculation is that great works of speculative philosophy ask us to reorient ourselves. And then when we come back to present perception, because we have we've done this, if we're going to be Aristotelian, kind of joy of contemplation in ourselves, I want to say that we're better for it. And ultimately down the line, it will be useful. I can, again, just to give a very brief version of a process and reality for a book for myself, that's a book that has consolation for me as an exercise of imagining my role in the kind of dynamic process of the world. And although people wouldn't figure it out for, I don't know, again, another 40, 50 years, this section on mereotopology is what things like the Xbox use to analogize the kinds of ways we organize space. So I do think there is productive use for these grand visions, and I would include Leibniz and calculus here and plenty of other things that emerge out of it. I don't mean my use that, oh, it just has to be relevant for us just at this moment. And I actually have great faith that some of these grand visions in all sorts of different ways have this power and implications in ways we can't see. In fact, I'll end with Whitehead's vision of coherence is the weirdest view of coherence you'll ever have, which is part of the idea he has is that coherence means it's coherent in the world. And then I should add with applicability that it's applicable in ways, Charlie Herman might be able to correct me here if I'm writing, but applicable means it's applicable in ways we can't even see yet. Not only does it have explanatory value, but as time goes on, we see new insights for it. And last example I'll give of, there's other great works in different kinds of practices, like in art and literature with Shakespeare. I think there's ways a play like Hamlet renews itself, gives us new insights and ways to articulate things that are happening in the world that we wouldn't have seen at a different moment. So I'll end with that. And teaching, and as for teaching, yes, but it's the same problem we talked about yesterday, that it's really slow work and it's training people to have an experience that I think it takes really a graduate level of education to really appreciate. So that's the short version. Our classrooms are not really conducive to this kind of speculative reading. That's why it's always esoteric writings that are taught this way in philosophical traditions across the world.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you so much. We do need to move on. We're a little past time, but I think we can probably just be a little bit extended today. So our next speaker gives me great pleasure to invite to speak is Marta Faustino, and she is a research fellow at the Nova Institute of Philosophy in Portugal. She's also recently the lead author or applicant for a grant on philosophy as a way of life, and she's continuing her paper today, the theme of, I guess, metaphilosophy that we've already glimpsed, and the title of the paper is, as you can see, indeed, On the Tension Field Between Metaphilosophy and History of Philosophy. So, Marta. Marta, are you there?
Sorry, sorry, I was not being able to switch off my microphone. So good morning or good evening, and thanks, Matthew, so much. Thank you for organizing this beautiful event and for inviting me. I've been learning a lot in these last few days, and it's an honor and a pleasure to make a presentation among this group of PWL experts and some of you friends. I do hope this will give us the impulse to create a network and gather more often in the future. So my presentation will in a way be very different from the preceding ones, since I will not focus on particular authors, not even on a particular aspect of PWL, but rather on the reception of PWL and the much debated question of what exactly is philosophy as a way of life. Indeed, the expression is used today in a great variety of ways, including a metaphilosophy, a philosophical tradition, a perspective, a teaching methodology, an approach to the history of philosophy, a vision of philosophy, a conception, among others, which might end up generating confusion, especially taking into account that some of these senses might actually be incompatible, or at least so they started appearing to me while myself working on the field. So what I would like to share with you today is a kind of concern I've been having with the development of scholarly work on PWL, or a difficulty I've been experiencing when trying to make sense of what PWL is or might be in the future, and which I have actually already discussed with some of you, and which is essentially related to the tension that gives a title to my presentation between PWL as a metaphilosophy and PWL as a possible approach to historiography or the history of philosophy. So since the general theme of this conference is new research directions, and Matthew was able to gather here many of the most relevant PWL scholars working on the field today, I thought it would be important to make a kind of state of the art and discuss this particular topic here. And I will even try to make my presentation shorter so that more time for discussion remains. So, as interest in Hadot's work increased and PWL started emerging as an independent field of study in the last decades, we have witnessed a proliferation of scholarly work on Hadot and in Hadot's wake, which is not exactly the same thing, that while attempting to remain faithful to Hadot's work, also try to build upon it and develop new and fruitful trends of research. These trends are, of course, already hinted at, even if not fully developed by Hadot himself. More concretely, when Hadot develops his work on philosophy as a way of life, he seems to move into three different, even if interrelated, directions. First and foremost, he presents an original and revolutionary interpretation of ancient philosophy, whereby it emerges not simply as theory or discourse, but as a practice designed to change one's perception of the world and hence one's entire being and way of living. Second, he extends this particular conception of philosophy to a few modern and contemporary authors who, according to him, were influenced by ancient philosophy and kept or recovered some important traits of it. Finally, he uses this conception of philosophy in a normative way to criticize current philosophical practices in modern universities, institutions, and academies. I have put in the slide some you can all see the new slide, yes, because sometimes this you are all seeing the transition of the slides, yes?
Yes, Marta, I think so, yeah.
So I've placed here some quotes, which I'm not going to read because they are quite known to all of you. So these three directions opened up by Hadot's own work have, in turn, originated three main trends of development of scholarly work on PWL, which often appear combined, even though they actually correspond to three quite different ways of understanding and determining what philosophy as a way of life is. So in the first trend, PWL is treated as a characterization of the particular conception and practice of philosophy that was at stake in antiquity. Ancient philosophy emerges then as a quite distinct period in the history of philosophy, which rather than teaching theories, theses, doctrines about the world and the subject, aimed at self-transformation towards wisdom through the practice of what Hadot calls spiritual exercises. Far from an arid and abstract discipline detached from the concrete life of humans, as people tend to conceive of it today, philosophy was an art of living, a way of life, a therapy of human suffering, and a guide to the good or flourishing life. Hadot's novel interpretation of ancient philosophy, followed by Foucault's, have inspired several new readings of ancient authors, some of them directly influenced by Hadot and or Foucault, others establishing concurring or even critical approaches. Examples would be Marta Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire, Julia Anna's The Morality of Happiness, John Sellars' The Art of Living, and John Cooper's Pursuits of Wisdom, 6 Ways of Life in Ancient Philosophy. Even though not all of these authors explicitly mention PWL, they all develop interpretations of ancient philosophy on the basis of a certain metaphilosophical conception that seems, at least to a great extent, to coincide with what Hadot describes as PWL. More concretely, they all emphasize the practical dimension of ancient philosophy and their impact in human lives, the self-transformative and therapeutic potential of philosophy in antiquity, the particular target and goal of ancient philosophy, namely to reduce human suffering and to guide human life towards wisdom and happiness, the technical conception of philosophy as an art of living, that is a certain expertise that must not only be theoretically apprehended, but also practically applied, the totalizing character of ancient philosophy, that is the way it encompassed one's whole life and quite literally constituted a way of life. And Hadot adds as characteristic of his account, not at all consensual among the other authors, the practice of spiritual exercise. Indeed, some of these books, and especially the last one by John Cooper, but also Nussbaum and Sellars and other authors such as Pierre and present complex and influential criticisms of Hadot's account, to which scholars working in Hadot's way try in turn to reply. Indeed, Hadot has been criticized for neglecting the role of reason and rational argumentation in ancient philosophy, for inappropriately deploying the notion of spirituality in his description of ancient philosophy, thus blurring the line between philosophy and religion, or for having generalized the already decaying form of philosophy we find in the Hellenistic period to ancient philosophy as a whole, among other criticisms. The discussion of these and other criticisms is a lively dimension of this first trend of scholarly work on PWL, which often appears combined with the clarification of some traits of Hadot's description of this metaphilosophical conception, such as his notion of spiritual exercises. What exactly are these exercises? Which ones are they? Of which types? When do they start? And do they remain the same across the schools? And so on. As well as the differences between the different ancient authors and schools, the precise moment and reasons that led PWL to cease being the predominant conception of philosophy in the West. Was it Aristotle already who introduced a purely theoretical conception of philosophy? Was it Christianity who appropriated all spiritual exercises, thus disconnecting philosophy from spiritual practice? Or was it rather modernity and the new conception of the scientific method represented by Descartes who made it independent from self-transformation? These are, in a way, questions that are still open in current discussions of PWL in antiquity, the first main trend of scholarly work on the topic. Now, in the second trend of scholarly work on the topic, PWL is somewhat expanded and used to describe a whole tradition of thoughts, a tradition which includes not only ancient philosophy, but also modern and contemporary authors who, according to Hadot, kept or revived the practical, existential, and self-transformative orientation of ancient thought. Even though Hadot does frequently hint in this direction, he is frustratingly vague in the treatment of most of the later authors, and although he mentions quite a few of them, ranging from Montaigne, Descartes, and Kant, to Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, he presents no detailed analysis of any of them. One of the most proliferous trends in the reception of Hadot's work has thus been to follow this hint and try to apply the PWL model to different modern and contemporary philosophers of the so-called PWL tradition. Already in the 90s, Alexander Nihamads read Montaigne, Nietzsche, and Foucault through the prism of the art of living. Simone D'Agostino explored the notion of spiritual exercises in the philosophies of Bacon, Descartes, and Spinoza. Ansel Pearson and Michael Ure have provided interpretations of Nietzsche on the basis of PWL. Putnam and Putnam have interpreted pragmatism with a special focus on James and Dewey as a way of life. An edited volume led by Lucilla Guidi proposes phenomenology as a performative exercise and a way of life. And finally, in the most comprehensive study on the topic to date, Sharp and Ure present an overview of PWL across the history of Western philosophy, often referring to it as a tradition of philosophy as a way of life, encompassing very different authors from antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, and modernity, from Socrates to Foucault. Besides these major studies, one can also find chapters published in several edited volumes dedicated to the topic, such as the ones edited by Michael Chase and another one by Embury, which equally try to apply the PWL model to different authors and does include them in the PWL tradition, adding, for example, Leibniz, Miguel de Unamuno, Wittgenstein, or Mariestel, among others, to the list. Since some of these authors are more controversial than others, this kind of literature often includes thorough discussion of particularly contested figures, such as Aristotle, as in Matteo's presentation, the skeptics, as in Massimo Spigliucci's presentation, Augustine, as in Caleb Coho's presentation, or Descartes, one of the most polemic authors in this regard, trying to evaluate whether or not and why a certain author can be included in this philosophical tradition. Laura Muller's presentation on Mariestel yesterday also seemed to follow this trend. Now, in the absence of a clear and commonly accepted account of what PWL is and how it can be applied to different authors and periods of the history of philosophy, each scholar typically endorses a different methodology and understanding of PWL, on the basis of which each of the different authors is either included or excluded from this tradition of thought. In an influential article published in Parisia, What is Philosophy as a Way of Life, for example, John Sellars defines PWL as a metaphilosophical option, which is characterized by 4 distinguishing marks. Its ultimate motivation is to transform one's way of life. There must be consistency between one's stated philosophical ideas and one's behavior. Actions are ultimately more philosophically significant than words, and it must be transformative, although not necessarily for the better. In their comprehensive study on the topic, Sharp and Yu present in turn what they call the TENED, a set of 10 features that philosophers belonging to the PWL tradition generally possess, even if their particular configuration often vary. Among these features, the authors isolate the 5th, the turning inwards, as, and I quote, the founding premise for any conception of PWL, insofar as the latter maintains that philosophical discourse, through teaching and intellectual exercises, can change people's deep-set beliefs, end of quote, which is, in turn, the condition of possibility of lasting ethical or spiritual transformation. Finally, in his presentation at the first day of this conference, Massimo Pigliucci defines another set of 3 features a philosophy must manifest in order to be a philosophy of life. Namely, it must possess a metaphysics or ontology, a certain account of how the world works, an ethics, that is a set of principles or guidelines on how to interact with the world, and finally, practices, that is guidance for application of ethics. This list is, of course, far from exhaustive, as I've mentioned. Each scholar typically endorses a different methodology, understanding, and definition of PWL in his or her work. What I wanted to point out with these 3 examples of 3 different attempts to characterize PWL in a broader sense is that first, some core characteristics of what was really distinct and peculiar of ancient philosophy tend to disappear. Most notably, its totalizing character and the way philosophy did indeed shape and was identifiable with one's way of life. Second, the definition of PWL becomes wider, more general, and loses specificity. And third, when it comes to this broader sense of PWL, scholars obviously diverge in what they consider essential in this metaphilosophical conception. Things become even more complicated in the third and final main trend of research, use, and application of PWL. In this third trend, philosophy as a way of life is rather conceived as a certain hermeneutic and methodological approach to the history of philosophy. This approach consists in bringing the practical, self-transforming, and life-changing potential of philosophy to the fore, as well as the specific worldviews, attitudes, ways of living, and exercises of self-transformation contained in each philosophy, to the detriment of the philosophical theories and doctrines that tend to be at the center of more traditional accounts of the history of philosophy. In the wake of Hadot and Foucault, scholars working in this direction suggest that by increasing attention to the particular attitudes, ways of living, and practices of self-transformation, by increasing attention to the particular attitudes, ways of living, and practices of self-transformation implied in different philosophies, rather than focusing exclusively on the theories conveyed by them, we obtain not only a better understanding of philosophical theories, but also another history of philosophy. In Foucault's own clarification, a history of philosophy which would not be a history of philosophical doctrines, but a history of forms, modes, and styles of life, a history of the philosophical life as a philosophical problem, but also as a mode of being. In this understanding, PWL is no longer restricted to a certain period of the history of philosophy, be it antiquity or a certain tradition, but it can potentially be applied to the entire history of Western thought, even beyond what is generally conceived the specific domain of philosophy, often including literature or other spiritual traditions, for example. And besides the purely scholarly work in this direction, and Sharp and Yu's mentioned book could also be considered on this front as probably the best example of it, PWL has also been claimed in this context to be particularly apt to appeal both to philosophy students and to the non-specialized audience from which philosophy has become progressively detached. As Michael Chase, Eli Kramer, and Matthew Sharp have put in their presentation of their Newbrill series on PWL, and I quote, PWL envisages philosophy as potentially having a direct, immediate, and positive impact on the lives of persons of all ages, genders, races, sexual orientations, religions, and political persuasions, since Hadot's work point towards the redemocratizing of philosophy, end of quote. It is to a great extent this PWL-inspired wish to redemocratize philosophy that has motivated the proliferation of trade books written by renowned scholars and published by major academic publishing houses, focusing on the ways of life and transformative practices of some of the main authors and schools of the history of Western thought, and their possible contributions and guidance to modern life problems and challenges. Examples would be William Irvin's A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Arc of Stoic Joy, Massimo Pigliucci's How to be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, How to Live a Good Life, or A Field Guide to a Happy Life, John Kagg's Hiking with Nietzsche, On Becoming Who You Are, or Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life, and of course the Oxford University Press series Guide to the Good Life, led by Stephen Grimm, which already comes with 6 volumes on Stoicism, Buddhism, Existentialism, Kant, Confucianism, and Epicureanism. And of course, there are many other books which could be mentioned here. The success and popularity of these books shows indeed both the receptivity of the general public to a philosophical orientation in their lives and the potentiality of the so-called PWL approach to bridge the gap between the academy and the outside world. And another side of the same phenomenon, which has already been called PWL movement, is the integration and application of the PWL approach in teaching practices as a way to change the way philosophy is perceived, taught, and researched in modern academies. In particular, PWL has been presented as a methodological approach to the study of philosophy with important didactic, pedagogical, and psychological advantages. Embry, Irony, and Wallace, editors of a special issue of Metaphilosophy dedicated to PWL, for example, defend the promotion of PWL in modern academies as an alternative way to convey the love of wisdom as not only a body of dogmatic principles and axiomatic truths, but also a lived exercise that can be practiced. In the same vein, Jane Wright argues for the benefits of shifting attention from discrete philosophical problems and questions to the integration of such questions and problems as, quote, instrumental tools to motivate personal growth and investigation into one's conception of the good life, defending the promotion of PWL-based courses, especially at an introductory level. Among those benefits, Wright mentions their higher impact pedagogical practices, their ability to more likely make students engage in successful philosophical practice, and their capacity to cultivate, quote, a holistic understanding of philosophy's importance, both generally and to their students' own lives. The promotion of higher impact ways of teaching and disseminating PWL is precisely the aim of the Mellon Philosophy as a Way of Life Network, a net of more than 100 international professors, scholars, and teachers who, according to their website, research aspects of philosophy as a way of life, share curricula, train one another on key teaching strategies, and support each other in teaching global PWL world traditions, ranging from Greco-Roman philosophy to existentialism, pragmatism, or Eastern spiritual and religious traditions. So, in a way, philosophy as a way of life has also become, simply and by itself, a teaching methodology. It is a particularly efficient way of teaching and disseminating philosophy to the wider audiences. Now, even though these 3 lines of development of PWL are interrelated and often intermingled, the fact is that they imply very different understandings of what PWL is, and hence of what it might become in the future for all of us working on the field. Even though the 3 trends use PWL as a certain meta-philosophy, that is, a certain conception of philosophy, what philosophy was, is, or should be, when it comes to define its particular traits and distinguishing marks, what makes it particular and distinguishable from other possible conceptions of philosophy is accounts evidently diverge. More concretely, as we pass from one trend to the other, as very roughly illustrated in this graphic, the conception of PWL is progressively widened and amplified, and as the number of authors embraced by the PWL label increases, the specificity of the notion decreases, and its distinctiveness as a particular meta-philosophical conception that is different from others and can compete with others becomes progressively blurred until it almost disappears, since it becomes potentially equivalent to the whole history of philosophy. Assuming that the gray circle is the history of philosophy and the red circles are the different trends of scholarly work on PWL and of conceiving the relation of PWL to the history of philosophy. In fact, when we reach this point and PWL potentially encompasses the whole history of philosophy, I wonder if we can still call it a meta-philosophy or a tradition of thought. At the same time, even though scholars tend to oscillate between the different trends, there is a certain inconsistency or even incompatibility between them, which is particularly evident when we compare or contrast the second and third trends. Indeed, if we consider PWL a meta-philosophy, that is, a certain conception of what philosophy is or even should be, that was developed in antiquity and then revived by certain modern and contemporary authors, such that one could speak of a PWL tradition and also think of a possible reactivation of the model today, this implies that when one looks at the history of Western philosophy, some authors will be included in this PWL tradition and others will not match the criteria and will thus be excluded from it, standing in meaningful opposition to it. If we consider, on the other hand, PWL an hermeneutical or methodological approach to the study, research, and teaching of philosophy, whereby certain aspects of different philosophies, namely the practices, exercises, literary genres, ways of life, normative ideals, and so on, would be emphasized to the detriment of others, namely the underlying theories, doctrines, and discourses of the different philosophies, this implies, by contrast, that potentially any author could be read in this light, and that the potential self-transforming effect of philosophy would depend more on the reader or on the way philosophy is researched and taught, for example, than on any particular philosopher. Now, since both trends, and actually the three trends, use the PWL label, and it is not always clear what it is referring to, or in what sense it is being used, this ends up generating confusion, contradiction, and a certain sense of PWL amounting to everything and hence to nothing at all. Indeed, if at the end of this process, PWL simply means that philosophy should have an impact or a transformative effect on one's life, can we really exclude one single philosopher from it? Is there really any philosopher, including philosophers from the analytic tradition, who did not aim to have some kind of impact or produce some kind of transformation on his readers? I believe that the discussion we just had around Eli's paper clearly suggested that. But again, if this is all that is implied with the notion of philosophy as a way of life, does it still make sense to call it a meta-philosophical option which would compete with others, or tradition of thought which would stand in opposition to others? Please don't get me wrong. With this reflection, I do not aim to criticize the work of any of you, and if any criticism would be involved, it would first of all be self-criticism, since I myself have engaged in this kind of conflict and duality in my own work on the field. I also don't mean to suggest in any way that work on PWL should be somehow restricted or restrained, as I'm the first person to rejoice in the growth of interest on the subject and the multiplication of uses and applications of PWL. However, I do think that in order to serve the promotion of PWL more broadly and to do justice to the work of Hadot, we do need to renew reflection on what philosophy as a way of life exactly is, and reach more clarity perhaps in the uses and applications we may want to do of it. And the best way to start doing this is, I believe, to turn again to Hadot himself and his own claims on PWL. So going back to the beginning of my presentation and concluding, so going back to the possible avenues of research and application of PWL opened up by Hadot himself, I think it is fair to say that first, PWL is clearly presented as a metaphilosophy, that is, a certain conception of philosophy, which Hadot describes in great detail and with great accuracy, but which, as a metaphilosophy, seems to be circumscribed to ancient philosophy and a very limited number of authors who were indeed directly influenced by ancient philosophy and strictly reproduced the model at stake. As I tried to show, the expansion of this metaphilosophical conception to too many authors or periods of the history of Western philosophy ends up weakening the conception of PWL, assuming that it arises in opposition to other ways of conceiving and practicing philosophy, and blurring what was really peculiar and distinctive of ancient philosophy, in contrast to subsequent ways of conceiving and practicing philosophy. Secondly, PWL also clearly constitutes a certain tradition in the context of Western philosophy, in the sense that there is indeed a certain number of philosophers and schools that during a certain period of time shared precisely the same conception and practice of philosophy and the same understanding of philosophy's main goal, form, and orientation. But if I read Hadot correctly, this tradition seems again, as a unified tradition, to be restricted to ancient philosophy and to that small number of philosophers who did explicitly understand philosophy in the same practical, performative, and totalizing manner. Expanding this tradition as a tradition beyond this limited number of philosophers risks leaving few philosophers that do not belong to the tradition, and hence, once again, nullifying what was really distinctive of ancient philosophy. It should be recalled that one of Hadot's motivations to develop the notion of PWL was precisely to distinguish the way philosophy was conceived, practiced, and written in antiquity in contrast to posterior periods, and even when he refers to a certain continuity or revival of the notion in modern authors, he does so through continuous reference to ancient philosophy. Finally, PWL is also clearly presented as a regulative ideal which might put our current philosophical and especially academic practices in question and also transform the way we relate to philosophy and fulfill our duties in the context of our academic positions. More than that, Hadot opens up a perspective that might change the way we relate to the very history of philosophy and who and what we consider relevant in it as philosophers, as scholars, or as teachers. Indeed, when looking at the development of scholarly work on Hadot and PWL, what we are witnessing is an inversion of perspective and reinterpretation of the history of philosophy that is in many ways similar to the one that, according to Hadot, occurred through the influence of the Church and the emergence of scholasticism in the Middle Ages. If in this transition the whole ancient philosophical tradition was depurated of all its practical dimension and self-transformative exercises, and reinterpreted as mere theory or speculative exercise, under the influence of Hadot, we are currently reinterpreting the whole history of philosophy as potentially a way of life and exercise of self-transformation. This probably simply means that each and every philosophy, or at least any philosophy worthy of that name, contains both dimensions, theory and practice, and admits both perspectives, depending on the one who is engaging with it and what one is looking for in one's engagement with philosophy. That his PWL perspective is opened or reopened, recovered, and made available for us today is probably Hadot's greatest legacy and contribution to the history of philosophy. So the attempt to reread the history of philosophy from this perspective is thus, in my view, a legitimate and extremely fruitful appropriation of Hadot's work, as the book by Sharp and Ure has masterfully demonstrated. But in order to do so, I believe, we do not need to kind of force any author into a certain metaphilosophical conception, nor to include him or her in a certain tradition of thought, as if that would be some kind of prize, which would in the end potentially encompass the whole history of philosophy as a fundamental dimension of it. Indeed, when we retrace or reread the history of philosophy through the lens of PWL, we seem to be exposing more about ourselves than about the authors we study, talk about, or teach in our classrooms. In such an endeavor, It is our own meta-philosophy and the way we understand, practice, and experience philosophy that is at stake. And it is ultimately this meta-philosophy made available by Hadot and the ancient philosophers that makes such an alternative history of philosophy possible. So to conclude, while I would reserve the notions of PWL as a meta-philosophy or PWL as a tradition of thought to ancient philosophy, I hope the Constitution, for completion, since Sharp and Ure have already paved the way, of this alternative history of philosophy will be one of our main research directions in the future. In the end, and in real practice, it might be argued that what I'm proposing might not even be very different from what we are generally doing now. But as a scholar, I do find terminological distinctions important, and as Nietzsche would say, important shifts often come in the form of nuances. So, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Marta, for such a thoughtful and observant paper, which I think, really, I think for myself, I found it extremely helpful in terms of a survey of some of the issues that I think exist, and there's been a fruitful discussion going on also in the chat around some of these issues around definition and, as it were, the extension of the concepts that we're using. So again, thank you. We do have time for questions. So Lucas, I see has a hand, unless I'm mistaken. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marta, for your great talk. I think I have mainly 2 points I would like to comment on your presentation that I'm also still trying to process in what way I could formulate it. But one thing that called my attention, and I think that's a very important problem that we really have to discuss when talking about philosophy as a way of life. And I've heard this sort of objection before, right? In the sense that, well, if philosophy has a way of life to be understood simply as something that brings about some sort of transformation, then we can safely assume that any sort of philosopher is concerned that what he says brings some sort of transformation into their students or disciples or whatever. But I do believe that the way Hadot conceives of philosophy as a way of life is more specific in that sense, and is closely connected to another term that we really have to have in mind when making this discussion about clarification of terms, which is precisely wisdom. Philosophy has the search for wisdom. Wisdom, and there, I think, in order to clarify our understanding of philosophy as a way of life, I don't think it's possible to do that without understanding what Hadot has in mind when he talks about wisdom. What does it mean to search for wisdom? It's not to search any sort of transformation into our lives, because sure, a lot of things that we can do can change how we live. That's not the point. That would be too broad. The point is, what sort of exercises contribute to bringing us closer to this state of wisdom as conceived by Hadot, in which he emphasizes, look, wisdom isn't the accumulation of all sorts of knowledge and so on and so forth. It's a state of being, a state of perfect tranquility, perfect peace of mind, and so on. So this might be a point that would be interesting to bring. When we're talking about philosophy as a way of life, as the term itself suggests, is the way of life that looks for wisdom, not just any way of life. On the other hand, about this thing, like that we run a risk if we understand philosophy as a way of life in a too broad way, then everything in the history of philosophy can be seen as that, and then it loses its specificity. On the one hand, I think that's true. On the other hand, I think that Hadot himself would say that this tradition is stronger in modern and contemporary times than we would at first assume either way. I'm not sure he would agree that it's only a few authors, because he mentions pretty much a lot of the modern authors that are relevant, like that we know for the most today, like Hegel, Kant, even Marx. He mentions Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger. Pretty much, he himself is claiming that all those authors are still connected to this tradition somehow. Which leads me to believe, and again, this is only a supposition, and I'm just bringing this for discussion, but sometimes I have the feeling that this change that Hadot says that happens in our modern comprehension of philosophy, maybe it happens more on an institutional level in the way that philosophy is taught and transmitted in universities and so on, than in the way that the great philosophers, the great figures in philosophy in those times conceive themselves philosophy as such. And I think it's no coincidence in that case that they often have critiques to the way philosophy is taught at the university and so on and so forth. So that could be another thing to take into consideration. But again, I think there might be a more specific criteria here to judge whether someone falls into this tradition or not, than just saying it's a matter of looking at theory or practice, because again, it's this idea of wisdom and the distinction between philosophy as a way of life and philosophy as a discourse. If you see a modern philosopher claiming, okay, we stop focusing merely on the discourse, fellas, we have to live this somehow. If this is within his discourse itself, I think this is already a suggestion that we can safely assume that he's within this tradition of philosophy as a way of life. But yeah, I think I'm just going to end otherwise. But just those two comments. Yeah, thank you so much.
Shall I answer right away, or shall we gather all the questions first?
What do you think, Marta? I'm happy with either methodology. It's up to you. There's already quite a lot, so perhaps you might want to respond to those two now.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Lucas, so much for the comments, and thank you in general for your participation in the conference. It has been great to hear your discussions of the topics. Yeah, sure. In a way, I think you're right, in that there seems to be something more specific in this conception of way of life than simply the aim to provoke self-transformation or an impact on the reader. And I think this aim or pursuit of wisdom would be a good hint or a good or a more specific criterion to define what is and what is not PWL. But again, no matter how specific criteria we have for determining what is philosophy as a way of life or what is not, I think it can always be argued that a certain author or other did pursue wisdom or did pursue transformation or did have some reflection on how to guide your life or that it has a therapeutic effect on you. And in the end, the more I think about this, the more I think that philosophy as a way of life has more to do with the reader than with the author himself or herself. Because as I tried to say at the end of my talk, even though probably I wasn't that clear, I do think that potentially each and every philosophy has the potentiality to transform your way of being and to guide you in the way of wisdom, as long as you relate to it in a philosophy as a way of life perspective. I don't think that philosophy as a way of life is a characteristic of certain authors, except for the ones that do belong to a certain tradition, in the sense that there is a certain conception of philosophy that is shared by this particular group of philosophers, and that explicitly aims at wisdom and self-transformation, right? What we are doing then in our scholarly work is to include, every day there is a new author which can be included, because one of us discovers that this particular author also has exercises of self-transformation, or also aimed to have an impact on your life, or can also guide you, or can also cure you of some of your maladies in general. but in the end, I do think that potentially each and every author has this potentiality. So it all depends on how you read them and how you relate to philosophy. And I think the biggest achievement of Hadot, for which we probably can never thank him enough, is for having made this very perspective available for us today, that we can get rid of the meta philosophy in which we were cultivated in philosophy. Probably all of us had philosophy taught in a certain way at university, and probably most of us have experienced this Copernican turn when we read Hadot and this alternative way of looking to the history of philosophy. So I think Hadot gave us this potentiality of looking to the history of philosophy itself in a different way. It changed our perception of philosophy, and hence what the whole philosophy can do with us. As scholars and teachers, I think we can, the best we can do is to promote this ideal and this way of reading and relating to philosophical text. But again, this is more on our side than on the side of the authors, I think. And thank you.
Eli and Massimo have hands, but I'm aware that we are now over 10 minutes behind. So I'm going to suggest that as there's also accumulating questions and discussions in the chat, that we can perhaps, as yesterday, return after Stephen's paper, which I think is going to provide more food for thought and really intersect, I think, around some of these questions, because Stephen Grimm, who will be known to many of you, is from Fordham University, and he's also one of the leaders in the PWL project, as well as at Notre Dame, which I believe has come to a conclusion now, but was a big grant there, bringing people together, as we've heard, to think about PWL, including in the classroom. So our final presentation will be from Stephen Grimm, and he's going to talk about how would you know whether which forms of PWL would be more successful, which I think is going to create some interesting definitional discussion as well. So Stephen.
Thanks very much, Matt. I haven't done this in a while. Can you guys see the slides? Yeah, Matt, maybe you could answer me. Could you see okay? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for organizing all this. I've actually just added a slide 2 minutes ago in response to Marta's talk, because I found that so rich and interesting. So I have a proposal, Marta, so I'll be very interested to see what you think. Okay, so the title's a little bit different. It's basically how to think about evaluating this program of philosophy as a way of life. Or maybe better, not evaluating the program, which makes it more second order or second meta order. But the question I'm interested in is how we can evaluate different philosophical ways of life, even just different ways of life in general. So how might we even get a grip on evaluating the different merits of like the Platonic way of life versus the Confucian way of life, or the Epicurean way of life, or whatever it might be? What criteria can we use to try to determine which is more plausible than another, or more philosophically impressive, or just better in some sense? So autobiographically, I've taught PWAL classes a few different times now, and this is something I've just tried to wrestle with in my own teaching. What am I doing when I'm presenting first, the Buddhist way of life, and then an Epicurean way of life? What are the criteria that I'm using to evaluate them? And I struggled, just to be honest, because as a philosopher, I was trained to analyze arguments, not ways of life in a straightforward sense. And one thing that I think makes it more complicated is thinking about philosophy as way of life on the medicinal or therapeutic model that has come up a few times. Alberti and John's talk yesterday was explicit that, sorry, you might hear sirens outside, I'm in Manhattan. which sirens happen all the time. It's crazy. Ambulances. So the medicinal or therapeutic model seems to be part and parcel of this approach. Here's a quote from Epicurus, which you're probably familiar with. "Vain is the word of a philosopher, which does not heal any suffering of man. For just as there is no profit in medicine if it does not expel the diseases of the body, so there's no profit in philosophy either if it doesn't expel the suffering of the mind." But if this is the model, the medicinal or therapeutic model, then it seems like the criteria that we would need to analyze these different proposals is almost a medicinal or therapeutic model. So if we say this is going to be the medicine for our ills, well, does it cure our ills? Does this particular approach heal us? Or if we're not thinking about a philosophy in general, if we're thinking about spiritual exercises in particular, do these particular spiritual exercises heal us? Do they cure our ills? And there, again, I wrestle with this because I'm just not sure that I'm well positioned to evaluate things along those lines. And they seem to be largely empirical questions as well. Another way of trying to get a grip on comparing and contrasting, say, the Platonic way of life and the Confucian way of life is in the neighborhood, I think, of what Massimo proposed yesterday. Well, each of these might have some implicit or explicit metaphysics, an implicit or explicit ethics, maybe an epistemology, and we could evaluate whether these metaphysical claims or commitments or ethical claims or epistemological claims are plausible or not. And that's often the way I've approached this in my own teaching, and I think it's a good and fruitful model to try to unpack, say, the metaphysics of Buddhism and then kind of analyze them. But in a way that loses the special flavor of the way of life idea, which is this commitment to practices. But again, the problem there is that the practices, if the payoff is supposed to be therapeutic, it's hard to know how to think about that. So what I'm going to do is try to just give you the framework which I've been thinking about in the last couple of years for analyzing this problem and see whether you think it's fruitful. So the way I'm going to approach it, I'll lay out the framework shortly, but there are kind of some guiding questions that help me build up the framework. First is, what does it take for something to count as a way of life at all? Then another interesting question for me is, what does it take for something to count as a philosophical way of life in particular? And then once we have a handle on that, where does the space for evaluation and critique and comparison open up within this framework? So I'm going to try to approach this through thinking of trying to lay out a few different ways of life in accord with this framework: the Platonic way of life, the Confucian way of life, just in broad terms. A Wallaceian way of life. This is the author David Foster Wallace. So each time I teach, or often when I teach my philosophy as a way of life class, I teach a piece by Wallace that many of you might know. It's a college commencement address he gave. And my students almost uniformly say, this is my favorite piece in the class. So I'll suggest how this can be understood along with the framework I'm thinking about. And then I want to introduce a Simone Weil's thought very briefly as kind of just another way of thinking about it in contrast to Wallace. Okay, in all these ways of life, I think there's a particular structure that I see. Okay, so in getting to the structure, I find it helpful to think, so what is a way of life to begin with? What do we mean by this? And I find it helpful to distinguish certain ways of life from just simple practices or habits or things we do. So just think about the way we could say of someone, so yoga for her or gardening for him isn't just something that he does or she does, it's a way of life. Or whatever it might be, fishing, it's not just something he does, it's a way of life. What could this mean? What I want to say is what a way of life involves beyond simply things you do. If yoga is a way of life for you, if fishing is a way of life and not just a habit or a practice, that it somehow encodes or brings with it a sense of what's more or less important in life, or what's more or less valuable in life. Goods or ends which help really deeply structure a person's life. So there are some things we do which might not even be anchored to goods or values in a way that even enables a form of life or a way of life. So playing Connect 4 could be something you do all the time. It would be bizarre. I kind of don't think there's enough just value in playing Connect 4 for it to possibly be a way of life, for it to possibly structure a way of life. But when there are things like yoga or fishing, maybe gardening, maybe there's certain goods there that anchor it that could possibly structure a way of life. So what I want to say then is that those goods that structure the way of life, that anchor it, that this is a vision of the good that again lay at the root or base of a way of life. And that this vision of the good, of what's more or less important in life, usually out of it flows certain practices or habits. Okay, so just give you an example of what I'm taking to be an anchoring kind of vision of the good. So Caleb and I have spoken of this in another paper. So the Spartan just pithy phrase, with your shield or on it, that apparently mothers and fathers were supposed to say, allegedly said to their sons, as they were on the way to battle. So what does that pithy phrase encapsulate in terms of a vision of the good for Sparta? Well, your self-preservation is a pretty low-ranking good on this hierarchy. So here, the glory of the city is supposed to be a very high-ranking good, individual or family honor, perhaps also a very high-ranking good. Your own life, preserving it at all costs, or preserving it, that's a low-ranking good in this vision of the good. And if I were to look to the left of this column on the right, certain practices or habits or exercises would flow out for Spartans from this vision of the good. Another one, so I received my doctorate from Notre Dame. This is something that was chiseled into the basilica at Notre Dame. You could see the phrase, God, country, Notre Dame. I would say, so this is Notre Dame's vision of the good. Here are these values that anchor this form of life at Notre Dame. So God is at the top, country is below God, and Notre Dame is below that. And practices flow out of this vision of the good. Okay. So those are some examples, but now I'm going to speak more abstractly. So the vision of the good, I want to say, it gives rise to certain practices, paths, or certain ways to get to that vision. And that in even more developed ways of life, I want to say, there's not just a vision of the good, there's not just a way to get there, but there's also theorizing about where we're starting from. What, with favors to Rawls, I'm going to call our original position. I want to say in highly developed ways of life, especially philosophical ways of life, there's something that's said about all three of these steps: where we're starting from, where we want to go, and the path or the ways or the Tao, if we want to speak in terms of those terms, that will get us from A to B. So the vision of the good is, again, a sense of what's more or less important in life, the ultimate goods to be realized. The original position has a theory, tells us something about where we're starting from as human beings. It has a vision of human nature. It articulates that. Sometimes it articulates not just our vision of human nature, but of our social and political embedding. What Laura was talking about in terms of Mary Estelle, that might be the social and cultural political embedding, could talk about the biases and prejudices we start with and we're seeking to overcome. Again, I think many developed, maybe all good ways of life, philosophical ways of life, articulate something like this, where we're starting from. And then the path or the way, the Tao, would be the practices, habits, exercises designed to move us from A to B, to where we're starting from, to where we want to go. And once you think of it in this tripartite way, I suggest a lot of philosophies fall into place. So you could have, say, different visions of the good, which could, again, espouse different goals. Maybe the goal is virtue, maybe it's autonomy, maybe it's authenticity that we're striving for, maybe an extinction of desire, maybe alignment with God's will, maybe harmony with others and with the world, maybe harmony with the Tao, maybe tranquility. Corresponding to this, again, I think in rich philosophical reflections on how to live, we have something like a starting point, the mess we're trying to get out of, you might say. It could be heteronomy, it could be inauthenticity, it could be disordered attachment or desire, it could be disordered love, it could be sin or pride, depending on the thinker. It could be selfishness, it could be false consciousness, it could be alienation. So in your own minds, I'm sure, well, as philosophers, we can identify different thinkers with different of these starting points and different visions. So the Kantian starting in heteronomy, how do we move from heteronomy to autonomy? Existentialists say, how do we move from inauthenticity to authenticity? A Marxist, how do we move from false consciousness to something beyond, or Freudian to something beyond that? Or just ignorance. Okay, so this is the general framework where I think philosophies of life can be fruitfully applied to this framework, and maybe not just philosophies, maybe almost any scheme, maybe religious schemes too. But I'm going to apply this now to the Platonic framework, the Confucian, this David Foster Wallace framework, and the Wei framework. I'm going to lay it out for you, and I'm also going to ask, so where does philosophy, philosophical reflection, where does it come in on these accounts? Okay, so if we're sketching this for Plato, we can ask, what would the Platonic vision of the good look like? What would the original position look like? And what would the path or the way look like? And I'm actually going to offer two versions of Plato, readings of Plato, because I think the text allows for it. There's what I'm going to call an intellectualist reading to begin with that I think Cooper favors, and then something richer than that. So what's the Platonic vision of the good? What's the thing we're aiming for? So we're the highest good on that hierarchy. I think it's a virtuous soul led by reason, where the virtuous soul is constituted by knowledge of the good, or knowledge of the good, the virtuous soul flows from this knowledge. So with that in mind, what's the original position? Well, again, there's usually a kind of anthropology, which, simplifying for Plato, I'm just going to say something like this tripartite souls with different psychic impulses moving within us of appetite and spirit and reason. We're characterized at the beginning, I think, by ignorance of the good. So how do we move from this original position with these psychic forces battling with each other to a harmonious soul, a soul led by reason? Well, we move from this by acquiring knowledge, and how in particular, I want to say it's something like through argument or dialogue or dialectic. So it's through these rational philosophical means that we move from ignorance to knowledge. That's simplifying a whole lot, obviously, but I'm going to say that's even just one reading of Plato. Here's another reading. What I'm going to call this is the second framework. I think it acknowledges that the goal is the same. The goal is the same, clearly, I think, in Plato, a virtuous soul led by reason and characterized by knowledge of the good. The original position is still the same, a vision of the tripartite soul, where we begin with ignorance of the good. But I think clearly in the dialogues, there's resistance, even within the dialogues, to the idea that reason alone is going to get you to this virtuous soul led by reason. So if you think in the Republic about the importance of listening to the right music and the right literature, that seems to be something extra argumentative that will be important for getting a soul that listens to reason. Or think of the Gorgias, where Callicles is fighting against Socrates. Socrates seems to have a compelling argument that should show Callicles that the life of power and pleasure he's advocating leads to something just disgraceful, like a life where the best life could be spent scratching yourself. And Callicles basically is unmoved. So he doesn't have a sense of shame where thinking that the best life could be a life spent scratching yourself would be a bad life, and he's not willing to admit it. So cultivating a sense of honor or shame would seem to be necessary for getting from A to B. Okay, now we can ask, so what role does, well, in this brief time, I can't get into it all, but we could talk about different visions of the good that are not just individual, but communal. Clearly, that's important for Plato. We could also ask, what role does philosophy play in this account? And this is really touching on, I think, what so stimulated me about Marta's talk. If we want to say, is this a philosophical way of life? Is this philosophy as a way of life? Well, clearly, yes, because the path or goal, path or way involves philosophical argument. If we want to think of the knowledge of the good, this apprehension of the good itself as a kind of rational apprehension, we think of that as philosophy. This is a richly philosophical way of life because philosophy plays a crucial role here. Philosophy, rational insight plays a crucial role here. But there are going to be other ways of life where philosophy it's not as clear how to lay it into the framework. And I guess what I want to say with respect to Marta's talk, this is a slide I just added, is that maybe you get a narrow sense of philosophy as a way of life where philosophical activity itself is somehow constitutive of the vision, the good to be realized, or the path or way. And you might have a narrower version of philosophy as a way of life, where it's just philosophical reflection is supposed to articulate or ascertain one of these stages. If that's suggestive, I could talk about it later. So where does critique enter into this if we want to start evaluating it? Well, we could evaluate now these ways of life along several different dimensions. We could think, is this vision of the good plausible? Is this path or way an effective path or way to realize the vision? Is this a plausible vision of human nature? Some of these critiques might be philosophical, some of them might be empirical. So we're going to see maybe the path or way, just we don't think this is an effective, in fact, way to get there to this vision. And we could critique again, like the final vision. So when Caleb and Massimo were arguing about Augustine yesterday, whether the best life, whether the goods of to be realized need to be, as it were, whether they need to be eternal or whether they could be temporary. That's an argument about the good to be realized, the vision of the good. That's one place where we could enter into and critique things. So when we're talking about evaluating different ways of life. Okay, now moving to Confucius too quickly. What's the vision of the good? As I read it, at least in the Analects, and the later tradition is a bit different. The vision of the good to be realized is the junsa, the exemplary person, characterized by benevolence or loving kindness, ren. What is the original position? What's our anthropology like? Well, we start with these sprouts, with these dispositions towards compassion or shame or deference or judgment. And what does the path or way look like? Well, what I would especially want to emphasize there is the idea of ritual. So filial piety clearly is important, love of your parents to kind of stimulate those sprouts. but it's ritual. It's these behaviors that move, that allow the sprouts to become full-fledged flourishing plants and allow the person to become an exemplary person. Okay, where does critique enter into this idea? And Matt, I'm realizing now I have a lot more to talk about, so just tell me when I'm like 5 minutes to go and I'll start to wrap up.
I think you've got about 6 minutes to 30 from when we started, so that gives you a sense. But you can go a little bit over 30.
Okay. So, as I'm saying, how can we evaluate these different forms of life? Well, in the Confucian tradition itself, there's a critique, as many of you know, between the idea from Mengsa, whether human nature is good, or from Shunsa, whether human nature is bad. So this would be a debate about the original position. So the way I think of Shunsa, are there, as it were, weeds alongside these sprouts, weeds of natural dispositions for profit or envy and hate? Or Mengsa, maybe there aren't these weeds, maybe human nature is naturally good. That's a place to enter into, again, a debate about the original position and to argue philosophically or empirically what's a better account of the human starting point of our anthropology. We could ask too, what role does philosophy play in this account? Does this count as a philosophical way of life? I am not sure in the narrow sense, because it's not clear to me that philosophical reflection could necessarily play any role in this movement from A to B. We could talk more about this in the break or in the Q&A. Moving to David Foster Wallace, he's an American author. Some of you might know him. What would the Foster Wallace version be of our original position? Basically, I'm going to summarize this quote. He says, our default setting is we're naturally selfish. Everything is about us. What's the vision of the good that would get us that goes along with this selfish setting? Well, I want to satisfy my naturally selfish inclination and desires and manipulate other people to get to them. What would be the path or way in this natural setting? Do nothing, business as usual. But according to Foster Wallace, this is the recipe for a miserable life, basically. My hardwired selfishness, if I let it run unchecked, I'm going to try to satisfy my natural desires all the time, and there's going to be nothing fulfilling about it. Again, just because for the interests of time, Foster Wallace then goes through and says, okay, what are different possible ways of visions of the good? There are visions that elevate power, beauty, success. He says, basically, it seems to be a religious vision of the good, or the vision of the good that where we kind of worship something beyond us is going to be the truly satisfying vision. And now just bringing things to a close and drawing a connection with Vey, and say what Foster Wallace claims is that the way to move from A to B, the way to move from our hardwired selfishness to something really satisfying, is to train our attention to keep making the right choices about what really matters. And I think Vey is useful at this point because I think what we should ask ourselves as scholars of philosophy as a way of life is it always up to us how to get from A to B? Can we always just attend to certain things and have our attention be fixated by those things and have a way of life flow from it? One thing I like about Simone Weil, again, just in closing, is that Vey is so interesting because she says attention is not primarily a matter of muscular effort, but of negative effort. Attention is a kind of waiting, which she plays on in the French. The French words for attention and waiting are very similar. So with Vey, there's an important emphasis on that it's not all up to us moving from A to B, that our muscular effort will basically not get us from A to B, and that we need something that's more receptive. So we might plant the seed, but we also need to wait for rain. So that would be a question, again, which I think we could ask of all these different views. Can you get from A to B on your own steam? Or does it require the cooperation of others, or luck, or good social conditions, or God, as on Augustine's view? And that's basically it overall, but let me just summarize just in a couple sentences. So in my view, there are these three main characteristics of a way of life: the original position where we start, the vision of the good to be aimed at. There's the path from A to B, and on all of these different spots, we can critique, we can evaluate, we can raise objections, and that might be a way to, again, start sorting out which of these are more plausible than others. That's it. Sorry for rushing.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
So that was really a lot.
Can you unshare your screen, Stephen, so
Yeah.
that way we can all see each other, I think. Excellent, and thank you for making it 30 minutes, and it didn't feel rushed. Your presentation, I thought, was very well paced and really easy to follow and very clear, and I think provides us with much food for thought, particularly in dialogue with the previous two papers this morning. Now, because I'm just going to try and bring people in who may not have asked as many questions as others. So first of all, Gijon, I apologize if I'm not saying your name correctly, but if you could go first, and then Caleb, and then Laura.
So, is it my turn?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So thanks so much, Stephen, for the excellent talk. Actually, I've been looking forward to it very much. I graduated from Nanjing University. So,
Oh yeah, Xingming,
yeah,
my student.
Yeah, but it's a pity that I graduated in 2017. Not 16. So I missed your lectures there. Yeah. Actually, I've talked with Xingming, and I think because I know you because of your research in epistemology. Yeah, and I'm kind of curious how you can have turn your attention or your research to PW work, and also I'm wondering, so because you've talked a lot about how to compare or to how to estimate the validity of this kind of therapies, and you mentioned several approaches. Although I'm not an expert in confusing them, I'm also trying to compare Confucianism and Stoicism, and also some Buddhism, and I think it's very insightful and very can help us to compare how people from different traditions they will see differently on the same topics, such as desire, and also how we can cultivate ourselves, and or how they perceive different virtues. And you just mentioned several very important concepts just now, such as the Jin, the noble man, and also benevolence, and also the filial piety and the rituals. They are all very important in Confucianism. But some people might say that since they are created or written in more than 2,000 years ago, and the society and the time has changed a lot, and also they're basically Chinese. How because I haven't discussed a lot with foreign scholars. I'm wondering. I'm very curious how will you guys look at the Confucianism and the Confucian wisdom. And also you could talk about Taoism, the Tao and things like non-action, effortless action and things like that. Because, even for me, this kind of theories or doctrines are very complicated. So sometimes I'm wondering, how you come to grasp this kind of difficult doctrines, even you want to compare different kind of approaches, different kind of traditions. I think it's a very important and also very challenging.
Yeah. Thank you, Xiaozhong. I really appreciate it. So just autobiographically, very quickly, the connection with my work in epistemology and this is, as epistemologist, I've always been interested in goods like wisdom and understanding which other people have brought up. So I find this tradition very helpful, the way of life tradition and thinking about wisdom. But you asked several very interesting things. So in the Confucian, I'll just focus on one thing, the Confucian tradition, I think one of your questions is so it's more than 2,000 years old, is it still relevant? And I would say that thinking of it in terms of these three parts might just help us to get a handle on the relevance. So is the vision of the good, of the exemplary person characterized by benevolence, Ren, is that still a powerful vision? I think that is. Maybe not in terms of the specific offices and ways, we're clearly not living the same way 2,500 years later, but a life of loving kindness and benevolence, that's clearly a powerful vision. The anthropology, is that a powerful vision, that we have these moral dispositions towards, benevolence and humility and so on? That's a very interesting anthropology. Is the idea that we need filial piety, respect for parents to nurture this, is that a plausible claim? That's a very interesting, controversial, but plausible. Where I would say it's clearly, I think most would agree, what's clearly outdated is the rituals that take you from A to B. Do you need to wear these clothes or have your mat a certain way? I mean, that seems clearly, I would say, as an outsider to the tradition, there would be other rituals that would facilitate the move from A to B more than what Confucius said, obviously. Anyway, that's you raised a number of interesting questions, but that's one thing I would say about that, about what's still valuable and insightful about Confucianism, for instance, for me.
Thank you.
Caleb?
Hey, hi, Stephen. More great stuff. So I want to ask about the sort of philosophical empirical division in evaluating those three aspects. Obviously, for all of them, there might be empirical considerations that are relevant, but also philosophical, maybe especially with the vision of the good, where you might think deciding, what kind of goals are worth aiming at in the first place. That's never going to be a purely empirical question.
Right.
Maybe similarly, something like the conception of human nature starting position, it's going to be empirically informed. But I wonder, so in that sense, you might think philosophy, at least in formulating and defending whatever way of life it is going to have an important role. But then I wonder if there's if you can sort of take a bottom-up approach where it would be a little different, when instead of sort of first figuring out what kind of goal to go for and where we are on our starting position, instead you're sort of more seeing through experience which kind of activities are helpful, or if you do take an approach more like Linda Zagzebski, and instead of like reasoning about the ultimate good, you look for exemplars who seem to be living a good life. Is that more philosophical or empirical in the role that it's playing? And sort of how do you see the balance? Do you think you can sort of, different philosophies might be more top down or bottom up as far as how they establish and what the sort of structure of justification is between the different aspects of the way of life? Yeah, that's really nice, Kel. I was thinking of the way I presented it, it's like you start off with a vision of the good and things flow out of that. But really, I think we might start off with certain practices that we find really rich or nourishing, and then like
through slow reflection, come to articulate the vision of the good that's been implicit in these practices. So I think that's important. And I did speak a bit crudely, like we start off with this vision, philosophically informed or otherwise, and then we work backwards. But in reality, I think it's more complex. So that might be an empirical dimension to it, of the practices which we find rich, give rise to the vision, and then it's kind of reciprocal in an interesting way. Does that seem plausible?
Yeah, and I think it might be different in different cases. Do you think maybe the middle part, the practices part, is going to be more empirical than or you think it go sort of, there's going to be a balance?
So generally, yes. Like, Michael Chase yesterday was talking, is Michael still here? I'm not sure, was talking about, mindfulness practices. Hi, Michael. Mindfulness practices, which would help us to see the world as if, for the first time. And Michael cited empirical work, which interesting empirical work. And I saw someone in the chat disputed the empirical work. So that I find to be like an empirical claim about whether mindfulness practices will take us from A to B, or whether aesthetic practices would take us from A to B. I think the most purely philosophical thing to take us from A to B, I think the purest philosophical life is actually the one that Massimo talked about. I think skepticism, where really the thing to take you from A to B, like where B is ataraxia or tranquility, and you're trying to find arguments that counterbalance each other. That's philosophy as a way of life, almost in its purest form. I think the skeptical way of life, where it's philosophy, philosophical reflection, that's really the engine that's taking you there. Maybe the Platonic dialectic is a similar kind of engine.
Yeah. Plato, Aristotle, contemplation, but
yeah,
it definitely seems distinct from other types.
Yeah.
Laura had a hand, and then her screen disappeared, and now she's back. Great, just in time. And then John.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I thought it was absolutely fascinating and very clarifying. So I have a lot of questions, and I'm hoping I can get the common ground straight that they share here. So you have this kind of way of evaluating various kinds of philosophical systems. I mean, everyone you were looking at was generally coherent. They have an original position. They have a settled, at least somewhat, vision of the good. They have a clear path to get there. But I noticed that when you started your talk, you were just talking about the rest of us, like the regular people, right? The yoga person and the gardener and the fisherman, and how they can kind of have ways of life too. So my question is informed by what about the regular people, especially because for many of us, we're about to spend a lot of quality time with family members for the holidays. And we're just coming off a semester of teaching a lot of, at least for me, non-philosophy majors. So I'm wondering if you think that people can have a philosophical way of life with a vision of the good and an original position and a path without being philosophically informed. So that's one question. Related to that is, can you have multiple visions of the good? And I'm thinking specifically of people who aren't professors or scholars of philosophy, who don't have the kind of systematic thought that a lot of us are, speculative thought that a lot of us are building. So that coherency that we often look for isn't going to be there. There's no ontology, and there may not be one settled vision of the good, but rather multiple visions of the good. And then my third question, which is related to this, is does the vision of the good always have to be an improvement over the original position? I'm thinking specifically of Wallace's initial point, which the vision of the vision was not what we would call good, but then there had to be an improvement in that. And I'm also thinking of my students who recently wrote things like, studying philosophy is something people shouldn't do because it makes you ask a lot of questions that ultimately make life worse. Right. So their vision of the good would
say that philosophy makes things worse, and what they see as good, I would not see as an improvement. I would see that as status quo or some kind of degeneration.
Yeah, that's all great questions. So is the movement forward always progress? Like, no, but there's another way to say it. Like, are we always in a deficient state to start with? Like, I'm pessimistic enough to say yes. Like, we're kind of selfish, messed up, something to start with, and there's development to be had. These are larger things to talk about. Your other question was like, does everyone have a coherent way of life? I think the answer is no. Many of our pre-reflective ways of life, even maybe reflective ways of life, are incoherent. We think that this good is the highest at this moment, pleasure is the highest at this moment, then something like knowledge at this moment. We're messed up in terms of our vision fluctuates all the time and leads to just incoherent behavior or something like that. And then I think another part of your question is, could you have a way of life that's not philosophical? I think clearly, yes. You could be a committed Muslim, Buddhist, Christian, you could have a way of life that's religiously informed, say, that has all these parts of it, which is not necessarily philosophical at all. Say, Islam gives you the vision of what's good. It gives you a picture of the starting point. It gives you a way to get from A to B. But depending on the way of practicing it, it might not be philosophical, as I'm thinking about it. It could just be
to clarify,
inherited.
those weren't my questions. And maybe I was being very unclear. My question was, can you have a philosophical way of life without being philosophically informed? And can we use your structure to evaluate ways of life that have incoherent and inconsistent visions of the good?
Okay, philosophical way of life without being philosophically, you mean without like studying, say, the great works of philosophy? Yes, I think so.
Yes.
I think so. Yeah. Maybe I'll just be terse then. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'm thinking of Montaigne's claim that he was accidentally a philosopher. Someone who wasn't accidentally and isn't. John.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. That was really interesting. And in fact, all three of the papers this evening have been really interesting. I've got lots of questions I haven't asked. But so my question, I guess, connects with your answers to the last two questions. So I was interested in this distinction that you draw between the goal and the path. And there's a sense in which we can think of goals as being philosophical in some way. So someone engages in a process of ethical reflection, decides what it is that they think is good on the basis of rational reflection and argument, as opposed to, say, simply accepting the belief system that a religion has offered. So we can think about the goals being philosophical. And we can also think about the path or the method being philosophical. And as you were talking about in the relation to argument or dialectic in the Platonic context or in the skeptical context, right? So and then you kind of answered my question a bit in your response to Caleb, where you said you thought that if the path is about argument in the context of skepticism or Platonism, that's the real philosophy as a way of life. So I'm interested in the other case, right? So what if you've got someone who has engaged in a process of philosophical reflection, they've decided what a good life looks like on the basis of reasoned argumentation, but then the path actually involves a series of fairly kind of automatic practices and processes, right? So Diogenes the Cynic hugging his statues in winter to build up his resilience, right? I mean, I don't want to use the word spiritual exercises because I think, but the exercises, the practices, the training, right, that he puts himself through isn't particularly thinking or thoughtful. But nevertheless, it's practice and training to get him to the the good life that he has considered and thought about. And I think we could imagine examples where you've got sort of very philosophically thought out goals and kind of an unthinking path. But we could also imagine someone who doesn't have particularly philosophical goals, maybe because they've, Thomas Aquinas, right? You gained your goals from revealed religion, but your process of articulating them might actually involve lots of sophisticated philosophical argumentation and reflection. So,
yeah. That's super helpful, John. It makes me realize that what Marta stimulated me to think, that maybe there's philosophy as a way of life, narrow, broad. In fact, there has to be a third category. So narrow was where like philosophical activity in some sense was part of the path or the vision. And then I was distinguishing that from someone philosophical reflection about the whole scheme, which would lead you to think, oh, this is the path and this is but the path, as you said, might be hugging statues or whatever. But then there would be someone who, as it were, would hug statues and do the thing in a reflective way because they realize this through their own reflection that this is the right path, or this whatever I'm doing at the end is that's really nice. So there would be someone doing that reflectively and someone doing that unreflectively, as it were, and that has to be a third category. With Aristotle too, I would think that this scheme might come up. So let's say someone hits the mean with respect to generosity, they give the right amount of money, but someone does it instinctively right all the time, and in fact they form a certain character which was quite generous and temperate and so on. And then you can imagine someone who does it knowingly, reflectively, like this is not just the that, but the because. And even though they're just giving money again, and even that's a more philosophically informed way to do it. That you're right, that does seem like a third way, different from what I articulated, and still a philosophical way of life, even though it's not argument and debate, if that makes sense. Does that sound
sure. Yeah, no, that's great, thank you. And I mean, I take it, you could still be, you could still want to insist that the richest idea of philosophy of way of life is going to be philosophical in both the formulation of goals and in the method, if you wanted to hold that view.
Yeah, that's really helpful, John. Thank you.
Massimo, then Lucas.
So Stephen, I really liked your presentation. I liked the way you organized things, and so it's helpful in general to think about things that way. I have 2 points. One is kind of a suggestion, observation, and the other one is more of a question.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, I really don't think we should be too worried about making any kind of distinction between empirical and philosophical. I've noticed that we have a tendency to do that. In my department, at the graduate school, at the graduate center, the joke is that the way to end the discussion is to say, well, that's an empirical question. And that's the end of the story. But in fact, that's a really bad habit that I think philosophers should entirely throw away. There is no sharp distinction between the philosophical and the empirical. If philosophy is not empirically informed, it's bad philosophy, I would think, no matter what. So let's just not worry about where the empirical ends and when the philosophical begins. Let's ask ourselves, is this useful? Does it work?
Right.
And then way to assess it as you were doing. Now, which brings me to one of your initial slides, I think, had this famous quote from Epicurus and about, philosophy is supposed to be healing people. And I think Epictetus said almost exactly the same things, and Seneca says something very similar. So it seems to me, and here, this is the question, you correct me, do you think that this is correct? It seems like your schema, your way of approaching things really is very analogous, or makes a strong analogy between philosophy as a way of life on the one hand and sort of medicine on the other, which is the Epicurean or Stoic model. You have a diagnosis, you have a prognosis, and you have a potential cure.
Yeah.
Right. And if you look at it that way, then all three aspects, all three, perspectives, there obviously can be, in fact, analyzed in terms of both empirical evidence and internal coherence, plausibility of argument, et cetera, right? So you really are talking about medicine for the soul, or something on those lines. Or is that completely off?
No, that does sound right and helpful. Maybe a helpful way for me to think about it is that original medicinal or therapeutic model isn't raw. I guess I was looking for a way to get a handle on it, to like pick it apart and to say that this is a good bit, this is the bad bit. What are we trying to cure exactly? So I think you're right. Even if we're thinking of the Marxist idea of like, we start with alienation, we move towards, what do Marxists say? What's the goal? Like,
yeah, that's right. The opposite of alienation. Not alienating anymore.
Something. Well, that's a kind of there's a disease state. There's a bad state we begin with. There's a healthy state we want to end with. So you're right. It does seem like therapeutic or medicinal. This just helps me to figure out, to get it clear in my own mind about what those steps look like, and then we could have fruitful debates. Like, is this what's ailing the patient to begin with? Like, is this the problem? And what does the cure look like? If we break it up this way, we might, me personally, I find I can make more progress.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Before Lucas, I'll pop Lucas's link to the contact sheet before people begin to disappear, because obviously people are more than welcome to leave at this point. So I'm just going to put that in there, and I'm happy to continue discussion for until really the top of the hour. Obviously others have commitments, so please just feel welcome to leave. Lucas.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much, Stefan, for your great talk. I think I'll just try to put my question very shortly, because I think I already talked too much. But in terms of the thing that we are discussing in the chat, I question myself whether the definition you're using of philosophical isn't already begging the question that Hadot precisely puts, which is whether philosophy is primarily defined in terms of rational discourse or reflection or argumentation, or there's something else that is connected to that. Of course, has a connection, but it's more has a priority over that, which is the way of life, which would be connected to this idea of wisdom. And that is also one of the reasons, for instance, why Hadot in the What is Ancient Philosophy often emphasizes, for instance, that cynicism can be considered a philosophy, even if it has a very reduced level of rational discourse or argumentation involved, or that ancient philosophers would consider politics and other people who led a philosophical life philosophers, even if they didn't have a particular philosophical discourse attached to that. So I guess my question is, to what extent are we justified in assuming that philosophical means rational reflection or rational discourse within a PWL framework that seems precisely to contest that? Not to contest that there is an important connection between philosophy as a way of life and rational discourse, but that is not rational discourse that defines primarily what is philosophy.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess, again, John's question about this has helped my own thinking just even the last few minutes. So I do think that it's rational reflection that has to be at the basis of this, because even if we talk about certain practices like hugging statues or giving charity, giving alms, you could do this. If this is in fact practices which helps you to, maybe that's not right, realize a certain vision, you could do that in a way you can philosophically endorse this, or you could do it in a way which is more automatic, culturally inherited, whatever it might be. That's not. So even if the end that you're trying to achieve is somehow a reflective person at the end. It has to be reflection that is grounds these practices, or that's intermixed with them, for it to count as a philosophical way of life. Maybe that's not your question. Maybe I'm not understanding it. Yeah.
It definitely is connected to that, but maybe I can make it more clearer with what seems to me to be the focus of Hadot's conception of philosophy as a way of life, which is again wisdom. Has the ultimate goal. I think that would be interesting. I found it fascinating how you put those different lists of ultimate goals or visions of the good. But I think Hadot would argue all of them, there's a meta vision of the good, so to speak, here, which is wisdom has a state of tranquility. And philosophy has a way of life, is simply this way of life that attempts to reach this state of tranquility. And different philosophies think that are different things that lead you to this state. So in that sense, just so you understand my point, in that sense, the focus would be less on whether you use rational argumentation in a sophisticated manner or not, and more about whether you're leading a life that aims for this sort of tranquility, to reach that sort of tranquility.
Yeah, thank you. So I would argue that idea of wisdom as tranquility is a substantive claim about wisdom, and that a more general claim about wisdom would be, I've argued this in different places, that the wise person is just someone who knows what's more or less important for well-being. So in particular circumstance, the foolish person thinks that their own status is the most important, let's say, or wealth or something. The wise person knows. So I think a substantive version of wisdom would be that the highest good, the most important thing, is my own tranquility, and that's debatable. I think we might be able to find figures or plausibly wise throughout history who took something else to be very important. So, but anyway, I think our sense of who's wise tracks who it is that we think has the right ordering of goods. And I think it's a substantive commitment to say that tranquility is the best, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions, either for Stephen at this point or for any of the other speakers today and indeed this week? Matteo?
Yes, please. Can you hear me? Yeah, actually, I would have a question for Marta, if she is still there. I think she should be still there, right? So, okay, hi, Marta. Many thanks for your presentation. Good to see you again. It actually helped me a lot also trying to understand better what I'm trying to do with my own research. I think that according to your own categorization, I would fall under the second strand of PWL scholarship, as I'm currently working my way through the Middle Ages to ascertain whether the so-called Latin Averroists did indeed revive the contemplative mode of life described by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. So interestingly, according to some scholars that I've been reading, the attempt of these professional philosophers to reclaim happiness as their prerogative was, at least in part, an attempt on the part of their professional category, on their professional class, to justify their own existence, to claim, to gain legitimacy and prestige, legitimacy and a prestige that in the context of the university, they didn't have, let's say, vis-a-vis theology or the other faculties, vis-a-vis law, for example. So my question would be the following. I'm actually wondering, to what extent do you think their situation, the situation of the Latin Averroists, might reflect our contemporary situation in the field of philosophy as a way of life, which is to say, is or could PWL be a similar attempt on contemporary philosophy scholars' part to regain a lost legitimacy, the legitimacy of our discipline or of the category vis-a-vis others?
I'm not sure I completely understood your question. I'm having
Yeah,
some
I'm sorry.
interference. You
Okay.
asked if
No.
PWL. Sorry, can you summarize?
Yeah, sure,
this,
absolutely. I was wondering whether do you think that PWL might be a way, or I mean, if there are any similarities between our contemporary situation in the PWL field and the one that the first professional philosophers in the Faculty of Arts of the 13th century they were experiencing. Let's say they at the time they were reclaiming happiness as their own prerogative, and according to some scholars, that was simply an attempt to, let's say, justify their own professional category. And so I was wondering if you see any parallels and between our contemporary, field of study and what they were trying to do.
Well, you're definitely better prepared than I to answer that question, but I do definitely see that parallel, and Hadot himself speaks about these two great tendencies in the history of philosophy, right? The tendency that he associates with the sophists, right, is the brilliance of discourse and language and words, and on the other hand, the philosophy and this potentiality to change your perception and your way of living. And I think since the beginning, I would say, but again, you're better prepared to reflect on that. Also, remembering John Sellars' presentation yesterday, I think this conflict in the academy or in the university and in the scholarly work has always been there, and everybody working in the academy now and then has been faced with this duality of approaches to philosophical or scholarly work. I don't know if this is a matter of how did you say, re-legitimization of philosophy?
Yeah.
But
Legitimacy, yes, or yeah.
A question of reclaiming legitimacy to philosophy, but it's certainly a way of finding your way in the academy if you are more keen or prone to philosophy as a way of life.
Thank you, Marta.
Michael. Oh, sorry, Marta. Do you want to say more?
No.
Michael, Eli, and then John. I can see.
Hi. Yes, my question is also for Marta, whose presentation I really enjoyed, but I'm a bit concerned about what I understood you to say, Marta, which is that whether pretty well anything can be interpreted as, any kind of philosophy can interpret it as philosophy of way of life, and it's mainly a matter of the reader's interpretation. I think I disagree with that. I think the author's intention is quite important in these cases. And I was just thumbing through Hadot's book on philosophy and spiritual exercises, and I see that he talks an awful lot about transformation, after all. And when he does, he talks about transformation of all one's interior life. He talks about a transformation that is radical and concrete, a transformation totale de la personnalité, transformation radicale de la manière de vivre, so forth and so on. On every other page, you find him saying that. Now, I guess, and I'm trying to think of my own experience as studying in an analytic philosophy department. And I simply cannot imagine any of my teachers of analytic philosophy ever saying anything like that at the beginning of the school year. What we're going to do is we're going to radically transform your personality. I don't think so. What they would have said was, we're going to teach you how to think more clearly. We're going to teach you how to solve problems. We're going to teach you how to argue and to analyze arguments. Now that will probably improve your life in some way or another. Will it profoundly transform your existence? Once again, I simply cannot imagine any of my teachers ever saying that. And I think if you said it to them, they would look at you with a blank stare.
Thanks, Michael. I think that too, starting from the end of your intervention, yeah, but I would say none of my teachers in the continental tradition has ever, or very few of them has ever told me or made me aware of the potential philosophical potential or the self-transformative potential of philosophy. That's not something you are usually made aware of in universities, be them analytically oriented or continentally oriented, or at least that
Precisely.
was
Well,
not my experience, unfortunately. That's why I think reading Hadot was had such a revealing effect on me, to the point that I call it a Copernican turn, or whatever, because it really shifts the perspective that you were cultivating on how to look on a philosophical text. Now, regarding the author's intention, for me, as a lover of philosophy, or as a scholar of philosophy, or as somebody who engages with philosophy, in the end, it doesn't really matter what the author intended, at least to me as a reader. I mean, I engage with what I have. I read a text, I relate to it, and I let it have a transformative effect on me. And it's relatively indifferent to me if the author had this intention or not. It might happen that the author did not have that intention, and it ended up transforming me, unwillingly, unintentionally. And yeah, I agree with you that having a small effect on the reader is not the same thing as provoking the profound self-transformation that Hadot refers to. And that's why I insisted, perhaps too much, that when we consider PWL a meta-philosophy, we should restrict it to those philosophers, those ancient philosophers who really aimed at this profound self-transformation, who made this profound self-transformation the core of their philosophies. What we are doing, I think, in the wake of Hadot, or when we try to apply the model to modern and contemporary authors, it works, it does work. I mean, I've read very compelling articles showing how, I don't know, or books showing how Nietzsche has a profound effect on, can provoke this self-transformation, or Kierkegaard, or Montaigne, or Spinoza, or potentially any author. But I don't think that any of them had that so present in their intentions as the ancient philosophers did. That's why I think it would be important to make a terminological differentiation here. There are philosophers who conceived of their work, of their philosophy in this way, as having the core, the central aim, the main motivation to provoke this profound self-transformation of the student or the reader. And then there are the other ones who may not have intended that, but might still have that effect. And I think they are still relevant to philosophy as a way of life, as long as we make this clear separation of them. So in the end, I think I do agree with you in this sense, that this radical self-transformation that Hadot is talking about can only be found in antiquity. In the end.
I don't think Hadot would agree with you. I don't think Hadot would agree with you. He explicitly says that people like Nietzsche and to a certain extent Bergson do precisely want to carry out this transformation.
I know, but I always found this part. I know I'm very well aware of those passages, but I always found it hard, since Hadot doesn't really develop much on those later authors. I've always found it difficult to have a clear sense of what he meant by that. How can he compare, I don't know, a Nietzsche or a Kant or a Montaigne? Montaigne is perhaps easier, or a Bergson, to what you find in the Stoics and in Epicureans. In a way, they seem to me so radically different in their aims and purposes, even styles of writing, motivation. I don't know. That doesn't mean that you can't derive from them those philosophies of life. I think you can, but I'm not sure that was their primary motivation, as it was for, I don't know, Socrates. But I don't know if you agree with it. I would really like to.
I don't actually, but that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think Eli and John, and then I think we'll bring it together for a final series of moments and propositions. Eli?
Thank you all. One is just a comment for either Marta's paper, or as we were thinking of these kind of three domains, I think something that shows why some of the issues are at stake, and then one that it's just a reflection both for Marta and Stephen to help us think through as people who've done lots of organizing in the PWL field. So the first is the observation in the hermeneutic domain. There's in some sections of the PWL field, I think there's a lot at stake of this hermeneutic choice. And I'll give you an example. For the intercultural philosophers that are excited by PWL, again, to go back to what I've said in the comments, people like David Fiordalis, Matthew Kapstein, Stephen Collins, they think there's a big hermeneutic stake, which is, it's not just that oh, cool, we can apply PWL to another tradition and now interpret it that way. They are actually would like to go farther, especially in the case of Fiordalis and Kapstein, and say, PWL as a metaphilosophical position is a better way to make an argument for intercultural philosophy than by arguing that philosophy is a series of propositional arguments about, critically arguing about the nature of reality or the world. So they want to actually say, no, this hermeneutic better explains a phenomenon across cultures. And I think it's if you read the scholarship on it, they do pretty significant technical philological research to try to ground, essentially it's a pretty radical argument. So just to add at what's at stake, it's like, how do I say it? I think one of the things that makes the field so messy is there are big consequences for this, and people recognize that. And to give another example in intercultural philosophy, that's a big part of this argument, is the generation before, there are people like B.K. Motilal, who tried to convince analytic philosophers that Indian philosophy, from especially like, the Brahmanical and Buddhist traditions, especially Brahmanical, had arguments to offer for things like philosophy of mind. But the historians of philosophy said the problem with doing that is that's also pitching the deck, right? You're trying to reinterpret a very particular wisdom tradition to, and fit it into a modern articulation of what the life of reason about and what good arguments are. And that kind of misses some central insights from the tradition that we're getting lost in this translation. And Motilal was very clear that this was an intentional hermeneutic practice on his part. He was not naive about what he was doing here. So I have no answers here. I just think that's very interesting of kind of what's at stake in these decisions we make. Last comment, and this is the one I really wanted to ask Stephen and Marta, and I'll try to be quick here, but I was thinking of two anecdotes from the history of philosophy. And if I'm remembering right, this was a question before Frederick Beiser had written his book on idealism. Someone first asked him if he would ever do it. And he thought about it and he said, yes, but I would have to leave out Hegel. And then the other one is, and I'll explain the comment of it, is this famous line from Bertrand Russell, that the only thing two philosophers can agree about is how dumb the third argument is, the third philosopher is. My point in both is we know how difficult it is within whatever we want to call it, philosophical movement or emerging fields, to agree on what the hell you're actually doing. We know this from existentialism, where Heidegger hated the term, and pragmatism, Dewey regrets it. James kind of takes it up basically to defend, to try to articulate whatever the hell Peirce is doing. And Peirce hated being identified with James and Dewey, right? Like, what I'm trying to say is, and this is the question for Marta and Stephen as people are trying to organize the field, is what does it mean to organize a field of individual scholars who have their own creative orientations, inevitably, as you both pointed on these particular questions, but try to get, what's the consensus we're trying to build to develop a field that's going to reorient the practices of philosophy? Does that make sense across naturally very different orientations, because we're scholars who are trained to find new insights, to analyze things in a different way and cut the pie differently. So I guess I just wanted a little more from both of you of general reflection on what it means to build philosophy as a way of life work. And I know, Marta, that's partially what you're doing, but I'm just curious about, do you think, as you're thinking about trying to make sure we don't run into some of these contradictions, is it a matter of clarifying different perspectives? Do you think we should have some sort of meta set of values, maybe some, I don't know, a few declarated principles across, these different groups. Anyways, I'm not sure if I articulated that perfectly, but I'm interested in the second question, as both of you have done really important work for getting us moving.
Do you want to go first, Stephen?
So mine would be very quick. I think you have a long answer. I think the framework I suggest at least suggests a common area where we can debate. And then there's going to be healthy disagreement about the vision, the way, the anthropology. That's what I would say. But I think it would be healthy debate if we're talking about the same thing. Sorry, Marta, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Thank you, Eli, for the comment as well. And I've reflected about that as well while I was preparing my paper. And I don't exactly know what I aim to do with this paper. It's just a difficulty I've been facing in my own work on the subject, and also a difficulty I think people have with the notion of PWL. I've been faced with similar problems from, I don't know, students or people listening at conference, and I've noticed that as we progress in our work and more scholarly work is being done on the field, it seems that the field itself becomes less clear or more confusing due to the variety and multiplicity of approaches and uses we are doing of the expression philosophy as a way of life, which seemed in the beginning such a simple thing. Since we now have not only Hadot as an authority, but all the scholars working in his wake, and since we are all doing very different uses of the expression, it might become confusing and somehow take credibility to the very field of PWL. So I don't know, with this I also don't want to create some kind of orthodoxy with the uses that can be made and the ones that are not legitimate or not authorized, who would have authority to say such a thing. I just think that we are not so many scholars working on PWL, and I think these kind of events are a great opportunity, as Stephen Grimm said, for a healthy debate where we really exchange our views and eventually progress in some kind of common understanding, if possible, of what this field is and what kind of uses shall be done and which ones are not so fruitful, perhaps. But I think this takes time and a lot of discussion.
Thank you.
John?
Yeah. No.
John's been waiting patiently. John, is that a hand or is it?
Yeah, it is. Thanks. So, okay, gosh. So I've now got to try and been trying to adequately formulate my thoughts while people are continuing to say lots of interesting things, which is always a challenge. So, I mean, I've got a fairly general comment, which might not be a bad thing to come right at the end, prompted by some things that Marta was saying, but also picking up on some things that Stephen and I were discussing earlier, and indeed something that Michael said a moment ago. So, I mean, there is that kind of idea that, all really good philosophy is transformative in some sense. But then if you take that as your kind of framework for philosophy as a way of life, then suddenly all good philosophy becomes philosophy as a way of life, and the phrase kind of loses its distinctiveness and its content. So that sounds like something we might want to resist. And one way in which things are often defined are in opposition to something else. And in Marta's talk, she picked up on two things that come from Hadot when he's kind of contrasting philosophy as a way of life with something else, right? And one of those is where he talks about the rise of Christianity effectively replacing ancient philosophy as a way of life, right? So we've got a contrast between philosophy as a way of life versus say Christianity is a way of life, right? And Christianity most definitely is a way of life, right? It's giving you that set of values and practices in order to transform your very being. And then the other oppositional, the thing opposed to philosophy's way of life is, you know, for want of a better word, scholasticism, but without wanting to denigrate any of the medieval guys, right? Where it just becomes a matter of words and arguments that doesn't lead to any kind of greater impact in how one lives. So we've got something that's defined against these two different things, right? And on the face of it, that looks unhelpful, right? Because, you know, you're defined against a number of different poles. But there's a sense in which I think that might be a useful way to think about what this phrase actually means, right? So we're talking about philosophy as a way of life, as opposed to Christianity or any other religion as a way of life, right? So it's got to be philosophy. That brings us back to the point that Stephen and I were discussing earlier. You've got to do the philosophical reflection, decide on what the values are going to be that you're going to live by, right? Or your worldview, your metaphysics, your ontology, or whatever. So it's got to be philosophy, but it's also got to be a way of life, in the sense that it can't just be that theoretical discussion in the classroom that you then forget about as soon as you walk out of the seminar room. So those two oppositional poles that Hadot points to and that Marta stressed look like they're two ways in which we can think about why this is most definitely philosophy and it's most definitely a way of life. And that might sort of offer, you know, get us back to a starting point about how we want to define this. And just to pick up on, again, very briefly, something that Michael said that I thought was very interesting about his analytic philosophy teachers, right? So there's a sense in which their philosophy might well transform us in some way, in the sense that it might make us clearer thinkers and we can make better decisions, and we gain those transferable skills that my university management are so keen for us to talk about all the time, right? But it's not that transformation of our entire being in the way that Michael was talking about. It's not a transformation of our character or our values, right? And again, that brings us back to this idea of philosophical reflection and clarification on those goals that Stephen was talking about, but then actually following through and implementing them, so we get that significant existential transformation that Hadot stresses so often. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Stephen, in particular, do you want to?
Well, yeah. So I know, at least on New York time, we're about to hit 6 o'clock. Just kind of. So John, just quickly. So the oppositional bit. One side was a scholasticism. One side was like a dry, bad scholasticism. One side was religion the other contrast, or just other kind of inherited forms of life? Okay, then I guess my question would be, so sometimes I found it more philosophical, more helpful to think not of philosophy as a noun, but as an adjective or an adverb. Like what does it mean to be philosophical, or what does it mean to think philosophically? And then I would wonder, could you be, just as an adjective, could you be a philosophical Christian or Jew or Muslim? And I have to think the answer is yes, right? I don't know if that sounds, but then it would be like, so Aquinas, I take it, was a philosophical Christian where the data might have come from revelation, but then it was somehow philosophically endorsed or found to be on reflection plausible. Does that sound right? In which case the contrast gets a little fuzzy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea, I think the whole idea of Christian philosophy is actually a really interesting one in our context, because it helps to bring a whole series of things into focus, right? And if you think about someone like Aquinas, right, I mean, not that I'm any, that I know his work that well, but in something like the Summa contra Gentiles, where he says, well, I'm not going to rely on revelation because I'm trying to convince people that aren't going to think the Bible is a source of authority. So I'm going to have to do this all through the process of, rational theology and philosophical argument to get to all of those conclusions. So this is, I mean, there's a sense in which that is just straightforward philosophy, right?
Right.
I mean, Bertrand Russell would object, right? He'd say it's not real philosophy because he's already decided what the conclusions are going to be. But I think there are a whole series of really interesting questions there that are relevant for us interested in philosophy as a way of life to kind of get greater clarity on on how we
Yeah.
want to define things.
Agreed. And everybody, I have to scoot. I've got a dinner reservation, but
Thank you so
it's
much.
been a real pleasure to talk to you all. And thank you again to Matt and others in Melbourne for organizing. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Great to
Take
see
care.
you. It is time, I think, to finish up. I feel as though we could, of course, discuss so many things for a long time, which brings me to you know, the closing point, which, you know, really one ambition of this event was to make it the first of something else, something which would be serial in some way. And it seems to me that the best way might be for us to take up Lucas's offer to get in contact with each other through this database. People who wish to be on the email list can be on that email list. And then I think there are a number of possibilities. One indeed might be a journal, but one might just be a series of regular events if people are interested. You know, they might be monthly. We might begin once every 6 months. But something to you know, enable us to continue the conversation, because we are everywhere, and you know, it isn't always easy, and certainly in Australia there's not a lot of us doing this, as I think I said to some of the speakers, and perhaps that's the same in other places. So yeah, that's my final thought to you, which is as an invitation. And there's so many questions that are emerging about definitions, about the university, about cross-cultural possibilities, about particular figures, about other questions that might be coming up around key terms like spiritual exercises, reason, knowledge, and so on. In other words, you know, I think there's really great scope if people have the will. And I'd certainly count myself as one person who would have the will to try to do what I can. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say as a close. I wanted to thank Judy as well, and all the speakers. It always feels a little sad to be finishing. I really enjoyed this. I usually rush to the door at the end of philosophy conferences, but not in this case. So yeah, thank you. And any final thoughts or comments on any of those prospects? For example, maybe even a monthly event, or you know, what, you know, anything that strikes people as particularly plausible, or something they want to get involved in. Perhaps it would be great to just get a sense of what people think.
Just quick note that, you know, we're still thinking about a journal, and if you'd be interested in collaborating on that, we, you know, obviously me, Matt and Mike have good working relationship with Brill. We could consider there or other places. So if you would want to get on the ground floor of that, let us know, and we can all think about that together.
Yeah, we definitely need a cohort for an editorial board. You know, it's a lot of work, as people know.
May I, Marta?
Yeah, please.
Maybe it would be the right place and time to recall you, or to tell the ones who don't know, that there will be a project starting in Lisbon from January or February onwards, which is dedicated to the notion of philosophy as a way of life. The title is Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, Contemporary Approach. One of the main aims of the project is to rediscuss the meaning of the meta-philosophical meaning of philosophy as a way of life. So one of the gatherings that is one of the events that is planned is precisely to discuss the meaning of philosophy as a way of life. And then another aim of the project is really to somehow draw on the work already done by Sharp and Buret, and continue this history of philosophy as a way of life, or an art of living in the Western tradition, to build a sort of cartography of possible arts of living in Western philosophy. And yeah, I'm planning, even though I will write the members very, very soon. I have this good news that the grant has just been confirmed and the budget released just this week, so I can now get in contact with you all again to make these plans. In any case, even though the events are supposed to be presential in Lisbon, I'm also planning to organize a virtual seminar which would keep us in touch. I'm not sure about the form of it, maybe once a month if everybody would be available. Of course, the times are always very difficult to arrange in these different time zones, but it's something that I would be really, really willing to do if you would all, or at least a good part of you, if you would be willing to gather once a month. I'm more than happy to organize this in the context of the project. And of course, as I have already discussed with some of you, I would love this project to be the beginning of a kind of international network we could build around philosophy as a way of life. I think it's time to do it.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps that is what we're talking about, in some sense, a network or whatever we call it, and whatever that looks like formally or informally. But I think that sounds fantastic, Marta, and I really like the idea of once a month a seminar.
Okay, I'll be in touch soon.
Yeah. All right. With that said, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you, Judy, for being my help with the tech things. Happily, we haven't had too many tech issues, which is fantastic. So there will be a recording, and again, we'll work that out in sort of before Christmas, I think, and we'll make that available in some capacity online. All right. Well, thank you again, and yeah, have a good evening. Have a good good morning for those of us in Australia, and it sounds like hopefully many of us will be convening soon in different capacities. So, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Ciao.